got a terrifically exciting research agenda on the economics of wildfire risk and responses to and management of that risk, which we're really looking forward to hearing about. We're going to run this session in standard sort of seminar format. So they'll speak for the full hour, but they'll take questions throughout the talk. We won't have dedicated Q&A at the end, so feel free to put your hand up as you have questions throughout the talk. So thank you very much, Patrick and Judd, and we're really looking forward to your talk.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having us. Patrick, that's Judd. Judd will be with you shortly. I actually quite liked what the program said. This whole topic is called fires, which is great, pithy, maybe what we should have called it. But we're thinking about resilience and we're thinking about adaptation in the context of an increasingly hazardous climate. And what this talk will be is hopefully a tour de force of a sample of the areas of wildfire research where economists and other social scientists have and we think will make contributions. So my job is to start out by just kind of setting the stage. Natural disasters are becoming increasingly costly. This is data from the R&D arm of Swiss Re, which is showing that since over the last decade, both insured and uninsured losses in natural catastrophes have grown dramatically. So up to about $300 billion a year across the globe, with much of that remaining uninsured. Fires are an increasingly significant part of that, and these data also come from Swiss Re. And thinking in terms of property losses, the bulk of these losses are coming from wildfires in the US. So we saw a bit of this in the early 2000s, but since about 2015 or 2016, which entirely coincidentally is when Judd and I started working on this, we started to see larger, more damaging and more financially costly wildfires across the US and elsewhere in Canada and Fort McMurray in 2016. So of course, the biggest example of this, or the most salient example of this recently, is the Palisades fire and the Eden fire in Los Angeles at the start of this year. But these effects are starting to appear, and these losses are starting to appear in other places as well. So in the last couple of years, Greece, Bolivia, and South Korea, among other places, have seen significant fires in terms of both loss of life as well as loss of property. And so we think this trend of increasing global catastrophes in wildfire is likely to continue as well. There are kind of three categories of reasons that most people who study this agree that wildfires are getting worse. Any guesses? It's like the Price is or Family Feud.
Climate change and fuel accumulation.
That's true.
Depression policy.
I would call that fuel accumulation as well.
Urban encroachment.
Yes, urban encroachment. So the three reasons are: we've got a fuel buildup from decades of suppression. This is data from the US. What basically happened is in 1920, we got really good at suppressing fires. The US firefighting infrastructure developed into this like set of basically almost military organizations that are extremely organized, and over time, and especially with improvements in technology, got really good at basically stopping fires before they grew out of hand. And that worked fairly well for 30 or 40 years. Around 1980 and 1990, it started to become apparent that one of the consequences of this ability to suppress fires throughout the century meant that now the forests that might burn were increasingly full of fuel that would let them burn more intensely and make them more difficult to put out, even with improvements in technology that have continued to this day. So as of about 1980, we started to let more fires burn. We also sort of started to just deal with the fact that we can't stop all of them. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is just climate change. This is one of the many metrics that indicate that the problem of wildfire is getting worse due to climate change. The global fire season has increased dramatically. So the length of the fire season has gone from just a few months during the summer to almost year round in certain parts of North America. And the same is true in other places across the world. This is also, of course, correlated with increases in winter temperature and summer temperature, both of which are leading to more dried out fuels that are easier to burn. And the final reason is especially where like housing policy comes in. We have built many new homes in areas that are subject to fire risk. So this is data from the Rattleoff group of Wisconsin, and what they've done, they actually have a data set. This data set is from the US. They have an analogous data set for the entire world. This data set measures the number of homes in either the wildland-urban interface or the wildland-urban intermix. So those are jointly called the wildland-urban interface. Interface just means that you're close to burnable fuels. Intermix means your home is literally within it. In the US, we've gone from 30 million housing units in 1990 in either the intermix or the interface to 45 million. So a 50% increase. This is just under 50% of the new housing construction in the entire US during this time. So these are the three kind of broad reasons why we're seeing these changes.
Can you just explain the fuel suppression thing? So how does that work? Why is there more stuff to burn?
There is more stuff to burn because when you don't allow a fire to sort of clear out an area, you get the underbrush continuing to grow. So if you look at, I don't have this image here, but if you look at sort of just pictures of like the Sierra Nevada forest from the 1900s through 2000, you can see that it starts out as this like relatively cleared underbrush area. As time goes on, it gets thicker and thicker because we just stop any fires from occurring there. And then once it burns out, it gets cleared out again.
So it's not like people leaving rural areas and more vegetation covering fields and so on.
Not here. I think those dynamics might be at play in other places in the world. Yeah. Okay. Great. So we're here to talk to you about economic work on wildfires. I think this is a really interesting area of study for us because it kind of combines the environmental aspects that are interesting, the environmental science elements of fire itself and of vegetation and forest growth with questions about how people behave in relation to these natural processes. So these are unique natural disasters in certain ways. Typically, it's hard to predict exactly when a fire will occur, except that seasonally, we kind of know what season and conditions lead to it. To some degree, we can mitigate fires, as we've shown. Big fires, really big fires, are going to be harder to mitigate. But unlike a hurricane, there are resources that we can put to use to stop or reduce the effects of fire to some degree. There's a lot of dynamic implications of fire policy. Like if you choose to suppress a fire now, that has implications for what it means to suppress fire in the future. Spillover risk between properties, risk that's insured in private markets rather than through the federal government, and then of course the effects of smoke. So all these things make fires kind of unique to think about and fun to think about for us. Economists have made many different contributions to thinking about wildfire risk. We'll walk you through these three categories that we've sorted them into. I'll talk about different ways that economists have measured impacts on outcomes, social science outcomes that we care about, leveraging some of the causal inference tools that we know well. I'll also talk about the land use and wildfire management policies that economists have contributed to understanding better. Then Judd will take you on a tour of like some serious economics, thinking about the investments that are efficient or not efficient in property level resilience. Yes.
Is Canada also suppressing the fire the same way the US is in the West?
Yes. Basically the same pattern. So we as in Canada, putting my Canada hat on. So we have fewer homes at risk. Most of our fires occur in like the taiga or the boreal forest that covers the northern part of Canada, or the northern part of the lower provinces. And those fires tend to occur in less inhabited areas. They burn a lot of acreage. They create a lot of smoke, which is sort of the primary hazard from the Canadian wildfires. But that too is changing, right? Canada now has many more homes exposed to fire.
And they're like militantly suppressing the fire like
Yes.
US, okay.
Yeah, it was the same kind of thing. Like by the 1980s, everybody kind of realized this was a bad idea. But there's a lot of there's political headwinds to not suppressing fire now, right? Because there's homes there. Nobody likes seeing a fire nearby. Yes.
Is there also a story of rotation lengths? One could take out timber from the forest, or maybe use it for pallets, or would that be an economical case for that?
So yes, fuel reduction through like mechanized means is done. It's possible. It's very expensive relative to say prescribed burns. But it is possible. In most places, I'd say that prescribed burns are going to be cheaper per acre. So unless you really want the resource, like forestry, it doesn't generally make sense. But it is done because it's perceived as less risky than prescribed burns.
Just a quick question. So on the point about how it's different from other disasters, what about floods? I mean, many of these properties are shared by flooding as well. So is it really about the geography of the area, or?
I agree that some of these are also true for floods. Some of this we're thinking in contrast to like hurricanes, and it is going to vary by area. It's going to vary by like defensive technology. We're not saying fires are like completely unique on all these dimensions. We're just saying these are things that kind of distinguish them in certain important ways. Great. So this talk is a sample, hopefully a representative, partly representative sample, but not a comprehensive one of recent work in each of these areas. I will highlight that we are focused on rich country property losses as the sort of relevant economic losses here. There's a lot of good work, including by Moloch, there you are, on like agricultural fires and some of the implications and trade-offs inherent in that. We're generally not going to cover that work in this talk. Okay. So to talk about wildfire impacts, wildfire impacts are right-hand side that we generally study by leveraging some of the quasi-random nature of wildfire exposure. My toy econometric model here just illustrates that conditioning on, if we condition on the general area of a fire, the fuel loads, the weather, well, if I had included it here, then we would be conditioning. This is the very best stylized econometric model. Don't do this. But imagine I had more controls here. This would be a good econometric model. All right, moving on. Smoke is better. Smoke is better because it starts from fires and then it moves around in space because of the atmosphere. So it has like this additional layer of plausible randomness in here. And I just insert this, again, stylized econometric model, this hat here to suggest that you can instrument by using variability in atmospheric data like wind patterns to leverage wildfire smoke as a way to look for the impacts of say PM 2.5 on health, which I'll show you in a second. So it has nice causal inference properties if you take advantage of them, and that's what a lot of these papers do. I'll start with some of the fire impacts. This is an early paper. So the earliest paper is looking at fire impacts focused on housing prices because that's generally what was observable. This is by Sean McCoy and Randy Walsh. And what they find is for a sample of fires along Colorado's Front Range, what you see is that after an area is burned, there's kind of a drop in prices immediately after the fire that then rebounds and even eclipses control properties in the subsequent 3 years. What's interesting about that is they also look at homes that are not within the burn scar, but do have a view of it, and they show that being able to see a burn scar has a reduction in presumably amenity value in terms of the valuation of these homes that actually persists for the next few years. So this is consistent with more recent work in California that looks at effects on home prices as well, and also looks at effects on home size. Homes in burned areas increase in terms of prices sold and also in terms of their size. We're getting bigger, more expensive homes after fires. Now, the challenge with this early work is that this is focusing just on the entire burn scar. But there's actually a lot of heterogeneity within a fire in terms of what happens to properties. The main source of heterogeneity is that not all properties burn, right? Within what fire managers report as the wildfire perimeter, about 40% of properties actually get destroyed. The remaining 60% survive on average in the data that we've looked at. So it turns out the distinguishing between that is important. This is new work with Judd, John Comer, and John Voorhees got et al. Here. Sorry, John, he's not here, but I guess the three people in the room are, so. Great, so this is the glass fire. This is a fire in Napa and Sonoma County in 2020. This is the perimeter of the fire. And what you can see is that within the perimeter, these orange diamonds are destroyed homes. These green triangles are surviving homes. There's a lot of variation within that perimeter. So we're going to take that variation. We're to compare those homes along important economic dimensions, and we're also going to compare them to homes outside of this perimeter that we consider control homes. We also have a specification that I won't show you today, where we use homes that aren't even close to the fire. The first thing that we look at is that we show that the distribution of pre-fire income, so selection into who loses their home, actually has some important differences. This is the cumulative distribution of income for homes that are destroyed versus those that survive. You can see that destroyed homes tend to be owned by people with lower incomes. So we're exploring this dimension more, but this is a suggestion that there is important selection into losing your home.
Do you want to tell people, Patrick, that that is not a paper about the glass fires, paper about essentially all US wildfires?
I do want to tell people that. I think we just did. Thank you. Okay, so same paper, yes, all major US fires in recent history. And what we do is we take this data that we have on whether a home survived or was destroyed, and we split up the effect by that status. So this is the effect of the wildfire on their AGI reported through their tax returns. And what you can see is that you get these fairly large drops in AGI in the following years, specifically for people who lose their homes. So there's a channel that we're trying to understand better in terms of these losses that travels through the loss, primarily through the loss of their home. Work coming out of the Philadelphia and San Francisco Federal Reserves looks at mortgage delinquency and prepayment post-fire. They make a similar split by damaged and undamaged homes. And what they see is really interesting. First of all, they see increases in mortgage delinquency, so getting behind on your payments. It suggests that people are facing additional financial stress as a result of losing their homes, but not as of being in a burned area. But they also see this jump. This is an increase in prepayment rates, a big jump. So this increase in prepayment rates is, I guess, on its face perplexing, except when you remember that people are getting insurance payouts for this, right? It turns out they show elsewhere in their paper that they're getting insurance payouts, but those payouts are dramatically lower than the replacement value of the home, in part because of reasons having to do with California's Prop 13 that I'll let you read the paper, but it's an interesting view into the financial implications of these fires. Turning to smoke, wildfire smoke, along with wildfires, has gotten substantially worse. This is data from Childs et al., which this is the working paper version, but I think this is coming out in Nature soon. This group, which is primarily based out of the Stanford Echo Lab, has measured or imputed the amount of wildfire smoke all across the US. So this is gridded data. They've made it publicly available, by the way, so it's a nice data set to work with if you're interested in the effects of wildfire smoke. And what they basically show is that smoke, the presence of smoke, has essentially reversed the last decade of air quality improvements in other sectors of the economy. So this is observed PM 2.5. This is what they, when they take out the smoke PM that they impute, this is what the amount of PM would have been in the absence of smoke from wildfires. And they show that, yeah, you can see how it's reversed that decade of progress. So this has been a really important factor in air quality, and it's also led to lots of negative health and well-being effects. This is a paper by Marie Cabral and Marcus Dillander that looks at workplace injuries in Texas from exposure to smoke, and they see spikes in PM as you would expect, and also spikes for the next couple of days in workers' comp claims. Jeff Wynn and Marshall Burke run kind of a similar estimate. They're using the smoke data that I showed you a couple slides ago, and they're looking at smoke over the course of a school day when students are taking standardized exams. They see a decline, which is something you see in sort of the rest of the pollution impacts literature as well. You also see increased mortality. This is from the same lab at Stanford, and it's consistent with some non-US evidence from Indonesia that Seema Jayachandran's 2009 JHR paper produced, where you see a drop in cohort size as a result of agricultural fires there. So these are the different ways that economists and social sciences contributed to measuring impacts. I think there's still a lot we don't know. On the loss impacts, we think this move towards individual data is important. There's clear heterogeneity by loss category and ownership status. And we think it's worth exploring this heterogeneity. We're doing some of this in the paper that I mentioned, but there's going to be more work to be done. On the smoke impacts, I would say there is a literature here, but I think that there's still a lot more to know in terms of the effect of indoor filtration and mitigating wildfire smoke. There's a couple of papers thinking about the nonlinearity of smoke effects. They don't necessarily agree, so there's more evidence needed there. And then the long-term impacts of smoke, of course, there's only a handful of papers that look at this. I think this is an area, we think this is an area where the increasing availability of property data, census or health data, and then satellite measurements, both of the fires themselves and of relevant outcomes, will enable future progress, both in the US and across the world.
What about sort of contribution to climate change? Has it become significant?
Yes, so Canada's entire Canada's contribution in 2023, which was our really bad smoke year, was nearly as big as the US, India, and China as a result of the burns. Now that's complicated because those forests will eventually grow back, but that's like a pulse of carbon into the atmosphere. There is some like carbon footprinty quantification of this, but I think that's an area where economists could contribute as well. Cool. Okay, my second topic that I'll try not to poach too much of Judd's time to get through is just to think about land use and wildfire management. So this is a nice area to kind of bridge into the economics of wildfire management, because actually underpinning management is a set or a type of economic thinking, which the wildfire literature calls cost plus loss or cost plus net value change, which is just meant to capture that when a fire occurs, and you're thinking about spending suppression resources, you have to trade off the cost of suppression with what kind of values are at risk, what the probability of the fire showing, that fire actually appearing there is, the dynamic effects that I mentioned, and then the risk reward with electricity. So papers that look at these types of considerations include Augusto Hospital's job market paper, which I think is a really nice paper that compares or shows how urban building restrictions push people into high risk areas, high fire risk areas. Zooming out from that, Judd and I have a paper from a couple of years ago that shows how homes across the US and these wildfires really drive suppression costs. So you get a reduction in the difference between a fire that occurs close to the home versus a fire that occurs very far away. There's about a 90% reduction in suppression costs if you get a fire occurring very far away. So most of these suppression costs are really driven by the presence of homes, which lets us impute a kind of implicit subsidy or an implicit subsidy of wildfire suppression as provided by the federal government. Okay, there's other drivers of management decisions, of course. Andrew Plantingo, Randy Walsh, and Matt Wibbenmeyer look at this in a paper where they take these realized fire perimeters and show where they stop. Some of the factors that drive where they stop include what we show, which is that when you get more residential properties, the fire is more likely to stop. But also when the property is worth more, you also see a fire that's likely to stop, as well as the importance of like ruggedness and road presence. Meredith Fowley, Cody Warner, and Duncan Calloway have a nice paper showing how recent changes in California's transmission infrastructure have helped or not helped mitigate the fire threat there. So a lot of fire now have been starting, like the big PG&E fire, near or from these power lines. And what they basically show is that there's exactly one technology that there's one technology that is very effective at reducing ignitions, and that's fast trip. So they're able to show that by comparing to circuits elsewhere on these transmission lines, that the fast trip technology has reduced most of the vegetation caused ignitions along these lines. So using econometric techniques to evaluate different reduction technologies. The last sort of contribution in this area is by Ivan Iguera-Mendita and Marshall Burke. And this is looking at low severity fire that happens in shoulder seasons, so when the risk isn't as high. What they're basically interested in is, what are the effects of prescribed fire on future fire? Those dynamic elements that I referenced earlier. And what they see is that if you get a low severity fire, you end up reducing future high severity, very high severity fires somewhat dramatically for the next 10 plus years, which has, they show salutary effects on eventual smoke. Okay, so what don't we know here? I think we know, we can't change the path of the climate, at least not locally or regionally, but we can influence the two other factors, fuel loading and home presence, and that's what this literature kind of speaks to. I'd still like to know more about the dynamics of preventative management, for like different approaches and how long they're effective, what should we let burn versus not. Most of this work, again, is in the US, but as we're getting more fires in other places and better data in other places, I think those are important areas of research as well, and more consideration of these trade-offs between land uses. So beyond these landscape policies, the kind of other really important layer of resilience is going to be property level adaptation, and I am going to turn it over to my co-author to talk about that.
Okay, very happy to be back. Thanks for having us. So Patrick did a great job. I'm gonna take the last little bit of the talk and walk through a discussion that's more explicitly focused on managing risk to the built environment. I'm gonna think about risk mitigation investments, and I'm gonna think about insurance. So what I wanna do is I wanna give you a very stylized way of thinking sort of about a idealized benchmark for natural catastrophe adaptation as it applies to wildfires. And then the most of this section of the talk is going to think about this, new research agenda and adaptation frictions that tries to sort of measure what are the most important real world departures from this stylized adaptation benchmark, right? So I want to think about a very simple expected utility maximization problem. So imagine a property owner who owns a house or a building that's subject to wildfire risk. They're going to choose some amount of investment in risk reduction, in trimming trees and making the building less likely to burn. They're going to choose some amount of insurance purchasing, and they're going to maximize this expected utility function, which is going to depend on the distribution of wildfire hazards, the distribution of fire realizations, and then a utility index in each possible realization of the fire outcome, which will depend on initial wealth, how much money they spend making their property more resistant to wildfires, the damage that occurs in each fire state, which of course is a function of mitigation investment and the actual fire realization, net of insurance recoveries. So they're going to choose some amount of insurance between 0 and 1 here, which will be the fraction of damages that are getting reimbursed by insurance, and then net of insurance premiums, which will of course depend on the level of coverage they choose, and potentially also on how much they invest in mitigation. Okay, this is generalizable to lots of different natural catastrophes. One thing, and Patrick showed you a little bit of the Swiss Re data, one thing that's particularly interesting about wildfires here is that this distribution is changing really fast. So Patrick didn't tell you my favorite Swiss Re fact, which is that historically, in the long run historical average, wildfires accounted for 1% of global nat cat losses. In the past 5-10 years, it's like 7%. So the share of losses due to wildfires is growing fast. Yes.
Just a clarification.
Yes.
Perhaps it's a silly question. Does it make sense to you to choose insurance between 0 and 1? I mean, if you insure your house, you either insure it its full value or you don't insure it, right? Or is this?
So it turns out, so both in the data and in theory, that turns out not always to be the answer. So we'll talk in a minute about the optimal insurance choice in theory, and it's going to depend on the price of insurance, among other things. And when we get there, we'll talk about why it might not always be one. In practice, in the data, as I think Patrick told you, almost everyone ends up being less than completely insured. And there's various hypotheses for why that might be true. Okay. So before we think about kind of an idealized solution in general, what is this joint optimization going to look like? We're going to have two first order conditions, right? Because we have two choice variables. So the first order condition on investment in risk mitigation is going to equalize the expected utility cost on the right-hand side from spending another dollar on mitigation with these expected benefits, these expected marginal benefits that come from the reduction in the expected utility cost of retained losses. So I am going to internalize as the property owner some share of the losses that actually happen, and that share is going to depend on how insured I am. When I spend money on mitigation, I reduce those retained losses, and I also reduce my insurance premiums by reducing my risk. So those benefits are going to equalize on the margin the cost of spending more money on mitigation. And then on the insurance margin, this is getting to this point about why not be completely insured. In general, in these expected utility problems, when agents are choosing insurance coverage, the goal here is you want to shift resources from the no loss state to the loss state until on the margin, the expected utility benefit of shifting resources is equal to the cost, which is the insurance premiums. Claire.
So this is, as I understand it, this is all from the perspective of the homeowner.
Yes.
How much do we know about, or is it relevant to think about the margin of renting versus owning, and in particular in terms of where those losses are happening, but also the types of mitigation investments? I don't know how, some of that sort of structural and presumably falls on the homeowner, but if it's a question of maintenance or whatever.
Yeah, 100%. And so this is very stylized and from the perspective of the homeowner. In some of the work that we're doing with John and John, we're able to observe a little bit about who's likely to own a home versus rent a home. And in the future, hopefully we can get at some of these landlord-tenant problems, with incentive problems around maintenance that have been looked at in the energy efficiency literature and stuff. And for now, that's all in the background here. This is, highly stylized model. Okay, but if you'll give me all these stylized assumptions, why was this an interesting thing to drag us all through in the middle of the day? Maybe it wasn't. I think it was. The reason I think it was is that all of those stylized assumptions give you a very stark solution in a frictionless world, right? In a frictionless world, when the insurance price is equal to expected losses, we have a theorem that says a risk-averse individual is going to fully insure. They're going to choose complete insurance coverage to eliminate all the variance in consumption across states, and then optimal mitigation is just going to boil down to choosing the level of mitigation where the marginal reduction in expected fire damages is equal to the marginal cost of spending another dollar on mitigation. Putting that in English, idealized adaptation is going to take advantage of every possible cost-effective mitigation opportunity, every place where the cost of mitigation is less than the benefits. Any residual remaining risk after that idealized mitigation is going to get transferred to this perfect insurance market. Of course, that's not how things work in real life, but I think we still don't have a very good understanding of exactly how real life is different from that model, right? So I think to me, a lot of the really exciting work in the adaptation frictions literature is trying to understand what are the most quantitatively important departures from that benchmark, and where are there places to potentially, have policy solutions that can make things better. What are some of everyone has started to already chime in with things that are more complicated. Some of the things that I had on my list of ways in which the world is more complicated, property owners are usually not fully informed about the risks that they face. We already had some talk about imperfect information earlier today. That was great. Particularly for wildfires, they're a really important property line externalities. So my investments in mitigation have a lot of influence on my neighbor's risk when a fire comes through. And because of various insurance in the various frictions in the insurance market, we'll talk about in a minute, that channel where my insurance premiums get reduced to reflect my investment in mitigation is not always going to be there, and it's not always going to be complete. Go ahead.
Related to the second point,
Yeah.
is mitigation technology primarily like based on individual properties, or are there also sort of like area level projects that?
It's the latter. I mean, it's A and B. B is really important, and we'll talk a little bit about B in a minute. Okay.
If
Oh,
you're talking
yeah.
about
Oh, sorry,
it,
something,
fine.
yeah.
Just quickly, my understanding was actually that the insurance charges depend very significantly on what the house price is at any given point in time, that they really co-move with that. So is there anything you can speak to on that topic as well as in terms of what that might mean for the selection that you saw?
Yeah, let me back, and so my, I'm gonna talk primarily about wildfire insurance as it is, as, you know, it appears in US homeowners insurance. And in that market, which is a private market, but this is a good thing to talk about now, the amount that you pay for insurance is conditioned on how much it would cost to rebuild your house if it burned down, which is usually correlated with the transaction value of the house, but not as much as you might think, because if I go and buy your house, I'm buying two things. I'm buying the structure, and I'm also buying the land under your house. And in places like California, the land is actually by far the most important component of the transaction value. So insurance prices are gonna be dependent on reconstruction costs. Reconstruction cost is a little bit divorced from property values. Go ahead.
One way to adapt to fire is not to rebuild or not to live there.
Yeah.
Is that the margin where actually it would be optimal? Like,
I don't think so. So this is, I completely
building the
understand.
wrong
I
way.
get this question a lot, and I'm trying to decide whether to write a paper about this because I haven't done the science to answer this question, but I will give you my hot take. And I think we're on Zoom, so this will be my hot take for the whole world. We have this intuition that comes from flooding and sea level rise, right? And that intuition is, oh, maybe managed retreat is an important margin of adjustment. And certainly for sea level rise, it seems like managed retreat away from the coast is an important margin of adjustment. It's tempting to translate that intuition to wildfire and say, maybe what we need to do is either abandon existing communities or not rebuild communities when fires come through. If you look at the scientific models on fire risk, what we would call the return interval for this peril is extremely different than the return interval for flood. So in flood, we have a lot of what are called severe repetitive loss properties. They flood this year. It's extremely likely they're going to flood again in 5 years. That is not the case for wildfire. A really dangerous place from a wildfire perspective might have like a 2% annual probability of a wildfire. So if you were to rebuild, on average, you'd expect 50 years before you had another bad fire come through. It's not obvious to me that that's a margin where we need to be fully abandoning communities, especially when there is actually a lot we can do on the risk mitigation margin. But that's my gut hot take without having actually penciled out all the numbers. So if you want that paper, let Patrick and I know after this. Go read that paper. Yeah, Rowan.
Go the other way around and you said, could the state invest a lot more in doing whatever it takes to stop the fires from starting? I mean, I guess the heat's coming up, the brush, I don't know what's happening with that, but is there a sort of way of really reducing the probability of fires in those?
Yeah, so we do a lot on this margin. This is the ignition, reducing ignitions. I don't know, Patrick might remember the exact statistics, but we successfully suppressed 99% of ignitions. So that leaves 2% that could be addressed. The question is, it's never going to be 100%.
Yeah.
But certainly there are things that can be done in terms of suppression response and also in terms of kind of outreach of, Smokey the Bear, don't leave your campfire burning, and we do have a lot of programs that, encourage people not to drag trains behind their trucks on the freeway on high fire weather days, which it turns out is something that It happens more than you would think. Yeah.
Quickly does whatever the Forest Service work out what ignition is happening?
So there's a really, really cool technological innovation happening here. Among other places at my institution at UC San Diego, there's a bunch of smart engineers that have deployed a new network of cameras throughout the state of California. Those cameras are the kind of 2025 analog to what used to be human fire lookouts and fire towers, and they're a lot faster at detecting ignition. So there is definitely a margin there that, hopefully we'll see some movement on. Okay, I'll speed myself up a little bit, but it turns out there are also really important and interesting frictions in insurance markets. There are non-trivial cost loads in this market, which is the economics way of saying that stylized model where insurance prices are equal to expected losses does not generally describe reality. There are important wedges there. Information about fire risk is hard to process, hard to classify, and in particular, this fire peril relative to earthquakes and floods and hurricanes is less well modeled, harder to understand, more spatially variable, and that's going to do interesting things to insurance pricing. There seem to be important regulatory frictions, particularly in the United States, that may be limiting the degree to which insurance prices are able to rise fast enough to keep up with wildfire risk. On the distributional side, if you do think that there's going to be more movement towards finer-grained insurance pricing, I'll show you that has some potentially regressive consequences that you probably wouldn't like. And then lastly, the non-property losses that Patrick told you about, the income losses and other things are going to be very hard to insure through private markets. Okay, so that's a menu, right? If you're a grad student looking for a dissertation topic, grab one of those and go work on it and figure out how important it is. I think that would be a really great contribution. Let me show you a little bit of the stuff that we and others have done on some of those questions. So starting with frictions in the market for physical protection from wildfires. Given the documented fact that people generally don't understand the wildfire risk that their property faces and the existence of the large neighbor spillovers in protection benefits, it's reasonable to ask whether a policy that just mandates various wildfire adaptation steps instead of leaving them up to individual property owners may make sense. In fact, California, for many years, has had a policy of requiring a package of fire safety investments in all new homes that get built in high fire hazard areas. These are the California Wildfire Building Codes. Patrick and I have a paper where we've put together post-fire damage data from about 100 major US wildfires to do a few things. First, we try to understand the effect of California's building codes on structure survivability during wildfires. And so this is the first main result from that paper. This is a regression that is regressing the likelihood of a property in a given year being destroyed on the year that the property was built. You can't see the vintage indicators here. This is 1990-ish properties where the various codes start to come into effect. And this is all, by the way, conditioned on street fixed effects. So the intuition for what we're doing here is that we're thinking about areas that suffered a major wildfire. We're comparing the likelihood that homes on the same residential street burn down as a function of when those homes were built. So we're taking advantage of variation in year built within very localized neighborhoods. What you can see is that the homes built after the introduction of California's wildfire buildings codes are doing substantially better. The other figure that you can't see here is that parts of the Western United States outside of California haven't seen these same kind of vintage improvements in survivability, which is pretty strong evidence, we think, that California's building codes have been effective in reducing the likelihood of property destruction. That's an important result. It's not everything that you would want to know as an economist. Claire, go ahead.
The information point, how
Yeah.
Salient is this? I know there's the kind of flood risk requirement now that Zillow or whatever has to say, this is what
level this property is at? Is there a similar thing for implementation of?
Quite recently, there is more of this. So Redfern and Zillow will now give you fire information at the same time that they give you flood information, but that's just within the last couple of years. There's also good policy variation in California that various people are trying to take advantage of in papers now. I think since 2023, 2024, if you sell a home in a high fire hazard area of California, the state has to come do an inspection. And there's a disclosure that has to be given to the buyer about fire risk with a list of potential mitigations. And I am aware of several different groups that are writing the, sort of obvious paper that you would write with that policy variation, right? And see what happens.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That being said, those disclosures are more about your locational fire risk than your home specific fire risk. So they're not necessarily incorporating like, hey, you have a newer home, you have a lower risk. That information is, I would say, we looked at this in this paper in the appendix, and it doesn't seem to be getting capitalized in a housing crisis in what we see.
That's right. And the other thing is that this paper is looking backwards to an era when there was less of that disclosure. Now, that's right. Okay. So we know that California's mandates have made houses less likely to burn down. Does that pencil out economically? You can do a little bit of, first of all, cost effectiveness calculation. So we take our estimated changes in the likelihood of the house being destroyed, and we put that up against other people's estimates of the delta in the building costs that comes from making these additional investments. It turns out from just a cost effectiveness standpoint, in places with moderate or high wildfire risk, basically all homes pencil out. So these box plots are showing you the range of net social benefits from making these investments after you account for the change in the likelihood of my house burning down and the likelihood of my neighbors' homes burning down. That's why it's net social benefit. So for new builds on a cost effectiveness benchmark, we seem to be doing pretty well. It turns out, though, that if you want to take an already built structure and make these same investments, it is substantially more expensive. It's like 6-7 times more expensive. And so it would not be at all cost effective to mandate this full package of investments for retrofits. And we haven't. The codes only apply to newly built structures. We also think a little bit about welfare in the paper. So what does this tell us? This tells us that these investments appear to be cost effective. On welfare grounds, it turns out that this is a case where mandates also did surprisingly well. And the intuition there is that you can differentiate your building code by wildfire hazard. Wildfire hazard is basically fully observable to the regulator who's drawing the code boundaries. And that's a really important variable in determining the attractiveness of the codes. So unlike things like incandescent light bulbs, where you can't really observe an individual's, idiosyncratic utility for having an incandescent light bulb, this is a setting where a mandate can actually get pretty close to replicating the welfare results of an idealized, differentiated subsidy. Okay. That's mandates. Now, what if we think instead about price-based adaptation policies? That's something that I think we would more traditionally think about as economists. That's where we would probably go first. It turns out there is a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of policy investment right now in the US in subsidizing what we would call self-protection from wildfire risk. So encouraging and often paying homeowners to do things like manage the vegetation around their house. This is a picture from San Diego. The City of San Diego has a defensible space assistance program where they'll come give you an inspection and give you some money to basically take your property from this to this. The scientific evidence suggests that change is gonna be pretty important in increasing the likelihood that your house survives during a fire. This goes back to the statistic Patrick told you, that about 40% of homes in wildfire perimeters burn and 60% don't. There's good reason to think that this difference explains an important part of that. Okay, let me back up. So we've got subsidies for defensible space. I'll show you some more examples of that in a minute. The other place that I think there's a lot of scope for price-based adaptation policy is we're starting to lay the regulatory and the technological groundwork now to actually price these kind of behaviors through all the way to insurance pricing. So historically, this versus this has not really been priced in homeowners insurance premiums for various reasons. Now there is a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of technological innovation to do the kind of high frequency measurement and pricing that would allow you to price this in a real-time way. Other examples of defensible space subsidy programs, Sonoma County in California. This one, just to show you how common these programs are becoming, Patrick sent me this text one random day. He'd been out on a run in British Columbia and stumbled across this sign that, you know, they were offering 500 Canadian dollars to folks who would do various things on their property. And my first reaction was, wow, this policy is taking off. Patrick's, you know, on a random run coming across a sign for a wildfire mitigation program. And then I remembered that my friend and co-author is an ultra runner, probably logs like 500 miles of running per week. So he's seeing all kinds of crazy stuff out in the world of speed running. So I don't know what we can interpret from that. So what have we done and what have others done on the price-based policy margin? It turns out not very much. This is a good place for people to dig in. One thing that we've done is we've been running some randomized control trials in Oregon, where we're randomizing subsidy offers and information treatments across households in high fire hazard areas to see what moves people to start to take some action around managing vegetation around their houses. And the one, you know, real result out of that work so far is that offering just a small subsidy of like a couple $100 can really move people substantially more than pure information treatments. Okay. Couple other places where I think there's scope for more work. How are we doing on time, Claire? 7, perfect. Okay. One area in the physical mitigation space where I think more work is important, we have to figure out how to drive wildfire adaptation at low cost. So I showed you that slide about how expensive it is to do mitigation on existing structures. Houses are long-lived assets, right? So it turns out that there are lots and lots of already built structures in various in highly dangerous places from a fire perspective. And we need to figure out what are the low-hanging fruit that can do something for those structures at relatively low cost. One of the reasons that matters so much is that if you think about the fire peril, this peril is like spatially diffuse in a way that flood and hurricane risk are not. So this goes back to our conversation about should we rebuild or should we not rebuild? It's actually very hard to predict which property in any given year is going to have a fire. And so when you have a lot of properties, all of which have a, you know, pretty small likelihood of suffering a fire event in any given year, any mitigation investment that you might make for that property has to be cheap to pencil out. You might have, you know, several $100s a year in net benefits to play with, and it's hard to think about what can pencil out at that. Okay, that's one challenge. Another challenge, someone early on was talking about, you were asking about what about kind of community level vegetation investments. We really need to move the needle on the scientific side in terms of understanding what we call conflagration risk. So if you think about the 2025 Los Angeles fires, if you think about the 2018 fire in Paradise, California, the 2017 fires in Santa Rosa, those are all events where what started out as wildfires burned into cities and became urban fires, right? And that margin of when wildfires become urban conflagrations is really poorly understood from a scientific standpoint. We don't have very good models of how fires behave when the fuel is houses instead of trees or bushes. We don't have great models of the mitigation value of reducing vegetation relatively far away from areas that look like this, but we have reason to think that's an important thing to do. So there's scope to invest there. And it matters because once fires burn into these dense neighborhoods, then there's a lot of risk of the really terrible tail events that we've seen. So this picture comes from some work that Patrick and I did during the building codes paper. Then this is Coffee Park neighborhood of Santa Rosa that burned during the Tubbs fire. The numbers are just showing you the distance from wall to wall between these various structures in meters. So when you have high fire risk neighborhoods where there are tens of meters between structures, there's a lot of bad potential outcomes. Okay. Let me take the last 5 minutes and talk to you about insurance markets. So what have we done? I gave you a stylized model of adaptation. I talked about frictions on the physical protection side. Now let's talk about frictions on the financial protection side. Most of my recent work is focused on insurance in one way or another. Just starting out with kind of descriptive data. This is from a paper that I presented here last year. So if you were here last year, you got to see this truly excellent paper. And so this is just descriptive evidence at the beginning of the paper about the reduction in the availability of homeowners insurance in high fire hazard areas of California. This orange line is telling you that about 25% of people in the highest fire hazard zip codes have lost the ability to buy private homeowners insurance over the past decade. Those folks have, for the most part, moved to what's called the California Fair Plan, which is the quasi-public insurer of last resort. One of the consequences of the 2025 Los Angeles fires is that the Fair Plan is now likely to become insolvent, and that creates all kinds of interesting policy outcomes. Then on the bottom, we just have various statistics about the rate at which insurers are dropping their customers. What's going on? Why is this market having so much trouble? There are at least 3 challenges. One, wildfires are increasingly becoming this kind of catastrophic peril where when bad things happen to everyone at once. If you were here last year, Claire and Catherine Wagner gave a great talk about reinsurance. All of those aggregate risk problems apply here. 2, we have the regulatory frictions that I talked about that various people have hypothesized may be important here. 3, among cat perils, wildfire is one of the least well understood, and there are various reasons that those information problems make it challenging for insurers here. What do we know? What have we learned? One thing we've learned that comes out of the paper that I wrote with Meredith, Andrew Plantinga, and Jacob Gelman, and that I presented here last year, is we're starting to get some evidence, at least on what insurers are actually doing when presented with this challenging situation. So this paper is basically about how insurers are actually pricing wildfire risk in California and in the wild. We use some catastrophe model data, which are a state-of-the-art way of measuring the expected losses for any given home. And we line that up with insurance pricing data to understand basically think about trying to measure how much an insurer would cover to take on $1 more of wildfire risk on the same home. A couple of the punchlines from that paper is, one, we show that there's a surprising amount of variation across major insurers in terms of how sophisticated their pricing is. And there's also, you can see that variation in sort of sophistication in pricing wildfire risk flows through to the aggressiveness with which firms price. So there's sort of a cream skimming story here, where firms that know they're pricing on less reliable information are charging particularly high prices. Okay. That paper you saw last year, so I'm not going to give you a detailed rebuild of that paper. Let me show you something new. This is from a follow-up paper that Meredith and I have been working on for the NBER, Environmental Energy and Policy in the Economy series. So what we're doing here is we're saying, well, let's say you believe that the market is going to generally move in the direction of more fine-grained pricing of wildfire risk. That does seem to be the trend that we're observing. That has potentially good efficiency outcomes in the sense that it ties prices more closely to individual behavior and individual risk, and creates incentives to invest in mitigation. On the other hand, it also has distributional consequences. So this big table that's helpfully color-coded is saying, what if you moved from a regime where everyone in California was pooled into one big risk group and paid an insurance premium that reflected, on average, the cost of reimbursing everyone for wildfire damage in California? Then what if you moved from that universal pooling to various more and more fine-grained ways of dividing up the population and set the prices in each of those pools equal to average losses in that pool. What would that do to prices? Well, for most people, for about 75% of the population, various different fine ways of cutting up the pricing scheme, the segmentation, would reduce prices by a little bit. And then there's a tail of extraordinarily high-risk places that see enormous increases in insurance prices of like thousands of dollars. Does that matter from a distributional perspective? Another thing we show in that paper using John and John's graded environmental impact frame data is that the folks in the very top end of the income distribution are facing systematically lower fire risk than the folks in the bottom range. So those insurance prices are going to load on lower income folks. I will finish by giving you some kind of what I think are critical open questions in insurance. You know, there's a lot of policy discussion these days about having the government take on more of a role in wildfire insurance pricing. There is historical precedent here. So we got the National Flood Insurance Program in the United States after very bad floods in the middle of the 20th century. We got the California Earthquake Authority after the Northridge earthquake in the 1990s in California. We got a terrorism reinsurance institution after the 9/11 attacks. So there is this historical precedent of private insurers pulling back from these cat risks and the government stepping in. I think it's really important to understand what would be the costs and benefits of something like that in wildfire. There's really important questions about what health insurance folks would call ex post moral hazard. So everything that we've been thinking about is ex ante. What do you do before a fire? But when a fire happens, can I trust my insurer to give me a fair assessment of my losses and pay my claim quickly? If I'm an insurer, can I trust my policyholder not to exaggerate whether they had marble countertops, right? And then I will say everything that Claire and Catherine talked about last year about tail risk transfer is 100% operational here and really important. Okay, so just to wrap it up, you know, wildfires are a highly salient impact of climate change. We talked about 3 different sort of areas that the literature is focused on around measuring the causal impacts of wildfire risk, analyzing land use and wildfire management, and then these frictions and property level adaptation. There is this really important parallel literature, which we didn't address, that thinks about developing country fire risk and agriculture and smoke and forest loss. That's also an extremely important and growing literature. And there's just a ton of good work to be done. So please dive in and start working on this stuff.
Thank you very much to both of our speakers. This was terrifically interesting and informative, and I'm sure will inspire lots of new work on this important set of topics. So thank you very much indeed. We're going to move straight on to the next session on deforestation. So Chico and Alan, I think, are coming up for that.
We started like some private agendas for that.
I missed that we started late.
You kept it. Yeah, you were in a tight ship. That was good. We had a question. Yeah, too. So, well done. You sure you don't want your chair?
Which less.
Yeah, it's I mean, manage your expectations. Those, those easy through the ground. What are you still thinking about reinsurance? Yeah. Really?
Yeah, I guess so. It's
great.
right. Right, I'm not sure about how. Oh. It is partly ecology. Hi, everyone. I think we'll start there. So welcome to our 18th VoxDevLit launch event. This is our first one, which we're doing kind of hybrid in person and online. So you can go home and say you were part of history. There are going to be physical copies of the VoxDevLit you'll see presented outside on the table. So you can pick those up if you're interested. Or you can check out our website where you can find a PDF of this VoxDevLit and our 17 other topics that were covered. We're going to aim for like a 40-ish minute presentation, and then there'll be time for questions afterwards. So if you save your questions till the end, we'll also monitor the chat online to see if there's any questions there that we need to get around to. And yeah, just a final note from me to stay tuned. We've got loads of VoxDevLits coming out over the next couple of months on political polarization, migration, educational technology, and other topics. And the good thing about the lits is they're updated every 18 months or so. So they're always relatively close to the frontier of research. So that's me done. I'll hand over.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Feel free to ask questions like during the, don't need to wait until the end. Okay. I'm Francisco, and together with Alan, we are very happy to finally launch this survey here. We had contributions from Heitor and Eduardo. And so thank you, Oliver, for keeping us on track. Robin and VoxDev for incentivizing us in writing this. And so, right. So this will be a survey, short survey on deforestation, and we are focusing on the literature in economics, right? So we had to make this clear cut because otherwise we wouldn't fit on 15 pages. So sorry, we are going to make some people not so happy, but like we had to set some limits. And second, as Oliver said, I think the goal of VoxDevLit is to provide kind of a literature review that makes research more accessible for a broader audience, like policymakers, students, and also I think researchers from other areas that they wouldn't stop to read a full 50-page survey. Okay, and I think a second goal of ours in this survey is like to showcase that while force may think like looks like something that's very distant and niche, it's a thing that cuts across several economic fields, and we are going to show like research being conducted in different fields. We still have a lot of open questions, so please feel free to contribute. So hopefully some of you are going to identify points that they are on your research or policy corner that you can contribute or learn something. Okay. So what's the roadmap for today? First, we are going to talk about agricultural production as a main driver of deforestation. And here we are going to and get more material from the development and agricultural literature. Then we are going to think about deforestation agents as firms conducting economic activity. And here we can borrow from the literature on IO and structural models, so we can think about policy counterfactuals in a more structured way. Then we are going to say that like these agents that they operate in isolation, they trade, they migrate, etc. So we are going to link with the trade and migration literature. And last, we are going to think about how political constraints on what we can do about deforestation. Okay, so I'm going to start, and then I'm going to hand over to Adam. Okay, so yesterday, like Guglielmo and José made very clear that forest preservation is very important for carbon emissions, one of the main source of carbon emission in the world. Massive amount of forest, especially tropical forest, has been lost in this century. We saw yesterday how forest conservation looks like a cheap and very promising way to reduce global emissions both through preservation and also like some carbon capture. But no, and beyond carbon emissions, like forests also provide, they host a vast amount of biodiversity. They provide ecosystem service for areas very far from forests, like regularizing rainfall, humidity, etc. And they provide the means of life for millions of people that live in forests. Okay, so this is a global context. And the two hotspots of deforestation are Brazil and Indonesia. So these are the two top countries on annual forest loss in the century. So most of the research is focused on these two, right? So today we are going to talk mostly about evidence from these two. There are some scattered evidence from other places, but it's mostly Brazil and Indonesia. Here, C and Africa are very important, but there is very little research. So here's already like a shout out for an area that needs more research, deforestation in Africa, okay? And in Brazil and Indonesia, what's the main driver of deforestation is agricultural expansion. In Brazil, cattle ranching and crops, soybeans. In Indonesia, palm oil, right? There are some particularities that we can learn different things from these different contexts. So in Brazil, up until 2004, we had the highest deforestation rate in the world. And the Brazilian government started this massive program, PPCDAN, that's a national action plan, combining a series of policies to try to control and reduce deforestation. This policy, we are going back to that, they have been very effective. In the last decade or so, weekend enforcement like kind of reverse part of this process, right? So there is a lot of policy to learn from this evidence. In Indonesia, it has another particularity that's like the central government controls most of the forest state. There's been massive area of deforestation, but there is a distinction feature of Indonesia that they have this carbon rich like peatlands. So when you deforest, especially using fire, that's the most common. Not only you release the carbon from the trees, but also on the ground. So this potentializes of the emission. All right. So first, agricultural production is the main driver. And here we are going to group the literature in 3 points that I'm going to go one by one. First is, all right, so if agriculture is the main driver, we should think about improving agricultural productivity as a way of intensified production, reduce the pressure over the forest. Let's think about that. Then we are going to think about how can we use policies to reshape the incentives of people on the ground and reduce deforestation. And third, we are going to think about poverty reduction programs, that they align or not, that they can be helpful to decrease deforestation. Okay. So first, the productivity debate. So there are two main hypotheses, right? There is the Borla hypothesis, named after a Nobel laureate, that's higher productivity, increase intensification, so you need less land to produce the same amount of output. So this reduces the pressure on the extensive margin of agriculture. On the other hand, there is the Jordan's paradox that say like actually higher productivity reduce your marginal cost, makes marginal plots of land more profitable. So actually incentivize, creates incentives for you to expand production towards marginal plots, right? So which one is right? It depends. So in theory, Farouk and all, they reconcile these two and show that like the elasticity of demand for the agricultural product is very important, right? So if you have highly inelastic demand, higher productivity, just reduce price, but doesn't increase the quantity of agricultural products. So you need less land to produce. If you have an elastic demand, on the other hand, high productivity is going to reduce price, but it's going to increase a lot of production. And this increase in production may also like over increase the demand for land, expanding the forest, right? When you look at evidence, I think the evidence kind of aligns with this intuition, right? You have evidence that intensification programs on smallholders in serving local markets actually reduce deforestation. So here you should think about technical assistance programs for subsistence farming and these things. But there is also evidence that agricultural productivity gains in commercial settings where you have agricultural production to serve international markets like commodities. What this creates, like it, as you become more productive, change your comparative advantage, leads to specialization, increasing pressure on the forest and leading to deforestation, right? So we need to understand this more, like these trade-offs, and how to design, how to think about productivity without the environmental footprint. So second, policy interventions in the agriculture, trying to mitigate the expansion of agricultural frontier. Here, Brazil is key exactly because we had basically this lab with several policies being implemented at the same time. And a lot of research done trying to slice this big policy into the different components. Julian has a lot of work on this. So we have showed that using remote sensing data to provide like hotspot, like heat maps in real time to inform enforcement to act. It's very effective and cost effective. Condition subsidized agricultural credit to environmental compliance farmers seems to be also effective. Creation of protected areas, this seems to have modest effects. This is a much more open debate, like we saw something today. And also like some targeted policies such as priority list municipalities that they create higher enforcement on higher deforestation pressures. But this is higher enforcement, higher incentive on the both on the private sector, but also to local politicians, local mayors. And so when you align, create like higher enforcement, align incentives between local politicians and local economic elite, this also seems to be effective, right? And so good, we have a good starting point to think about policies to maintain or continue to reduce deforestation, but there is also research that the effectiveness of policies vary with underlying pressure, right? Both from markets, commodity price, trade pressure, etc., and from politics, political constraints that may undermine the effectiveness of policies. Okay. And Alan is going to talk more about this. So the other big umbrella that we did is how can we think about aligning poverty reduction and jobs with conservation, right? And so there is some research that direct payment is a promising tool. Direct payments here, we can think about payment for environmental service. But research also showed that design details matter a lot. Credibility, additionality, figuring out what's the right price that you have to pay. So details matter. There's another literature on unconditional cash transfers. And even yesterday on the proposals, there was like some, one of the proposals included some kind of universal basic income. So we need to understand like, all right, so if we do some cash transfer, universal basic income, how this will shape deforestation. Evidence here is mixed. So there is evidence from Mexico, opportunities that cash transfer actually increase local demand for goods, so increasing deforestation. And Brazil, there is this Bolsa Verde that's kind of a cash transfer in regions that they are more high value of preserving the natural habitat, but they are unconditional. And there is some evidence that it's weak evidence that they reduce deforestation, but definitely I think we can reject the hypothesis that they increase deforestation. So evidence here is mixed, and I think we need more work on that. And a more incipient literature that I think would also deserve more attention is thinking about alternative pathways to create jobs and create local economic activities that they are off farm, that they are that they align the incentives of the economic activity and the preservation. So there are some papers on tourism and ecotourism in Colombia and Brazil. There are papers on green jobs. So if you're going to have active restoration projects like that, you're planting trees, this creates jobs. So it's a way also like to shift works from deforestation towards reforestation. And yes, okay. So bottom line, I think the main takeaways from this part that we think like for future work and policy, for us to think about policy, first is like, we need productivity programs to promote intensification, increase yields of farmers in this area. We want agricultural productivity to increase, but we have to think of how to pair this without compromising the extensive margin of crops, right? So we need more research to understand this, how to pair these two things. We need credible enforcement tools. So here, the Brazil experience points to several promising avenues, satellite monitoring, condition request transfer, etc. And I say credible because this needs to be sustainable over time, because I think credibility is key for unlocking carbon credit revenue, as being discussed yesterday, and this won't come from Vera and etc. So we need how to credibly account all this carbon to bill for it. And we need to think how can we align economic opportunity and jobs with conservation, steering jobs away from forest degrading sectors or activities. And last, and we are going to, Alan's going to talk more about this, what's politically viable, right? What's politically sustainable? We need to consider political constraints on all these levels. Okay. So with that, I leave Alan to continue.
Great, so I'll pick up where Chico has left off. What I want to highlight in this discussion so far that's centered on agricultural development, economic development, poverty reduction, is that deforestation is a very nice setting in which we can study these classic questions in development economics related to investment in agriculture and poverty reduction programs. And what we're going to do throughout the rest of this literature review is to kind of pull that thread through other fields of economics. I'm going to touch on trade, I'm going to touch on industrial organization, I'm going to touch on political economy, and I'm going to argue that whether or not you care about deforestation, and you should, because it is of first order importance as we think about meeting our climate goals. But even if you didn't care fundamentally about deforestation and you just cared about these deep questions in trade, in industrial organization, in political economy, this is a very nice data-rich setting in which you can explore these questions. So that's where we're going to go. So I'm going to start with the sort of industrial organization side of things, where IO has developed very rich firm level frameworks for modeling what firms' incentives are and how firms respond to environmental regulation, including in the context of land use and agricultural land use, where we have these rich models that tell us how to think about firms expanding agricultural activity over land and choosing how to use land. And we saw this actually even in Lucy's talk, where developers are thinking about how to use land for real estate. There's going to be kind of nice analogous ties to here, where developers or farmers are thinking about how to use land for agriculture. Now, what's the main value of these models? These models, which will require us to make sort of a larger set of assumptions. The value of these economic models is that, importantly, they will allow us to simulate regulation in hypothetical counterfactual forms, and therefore to ex ante evaluate policy that has not yet been implemented in the world. And furthermore, through simulating counterfactual policy, allow us to optimize over the kind of policy parameters that we're interested in. Now, what's nice about the deforestation setting, and especially deforestation as it relates to agriculture, relative to the typical bread and butter IO setting of a cardboard factory or a sort of ketchup factory, is that actually, like the cement or cardboard or ketchup, agriculture is also a nice, well-defined, somewhat homogeneous kind of industry where we have a good idea of what the production function is. Okay, but I'd argue that the food supply of the world is kind of more interesting than the cardboard supply. What's the value of that? If we have a good sense of the production function, then that really helps in estimation. In the agricultural setting, it helps because we know from scientific models what crop yields are and how those crop yields vary across space. We also know the carbon consequences of developing on this plot of land relative to that plot of land. Why? Because we know where the trees are. And so actually, I would argue even better than the typical industrial organization setting where you have factory level data, and you have to assume that all production in the factory operates with the same level of carbon emissions because you can't really see the individual lines at play within the factory. In the agricultural setting, you see all of the land. And and therefore, on the margin as the farm develops here or there, what emissions are and what costs are. Because you measure both emissions via the free stocks and costs and benefits via the changes in crop yields and crop productivity across states through the scientific. Okay, so the theme here then is that deforestation is a data-rich setting that allows us to get a little bit more traction, even relative to the typical bread and butter IO setting. But we're also going to benefit from the very rich dynamic frameworks that IO has developed to think about forward-looking firms and how they think about the future and how they think about current versus future regulation. And what's nice in the deforestation setting is you can measure via satellites deforestation over time and agricultural productivity over time, which means you have panel data, which means you have dynamic data, which is important. You can't estimate a dynamic framework without dynamic data. You need the data over time. You have that in the deforestation setting. And then lastly, and this kind of echoes other pockets of use of scientific engineering models throughout environmental economics. Also in the deforestation, we can benefit from the scientific climate models that have been developed that help us to think about evapotranspiration, how that interacts with deforestation, to enrich our economic models with scientific understanding. Okay, so then as we think about policy takeaways in future work, where do we want to go, both as policymakers and as academics? We want to take very seriously the incentives that the market presents firms with, and whether these incentives encourage deforestation or not. We also want to think about dynamic responses because firms, to the extent that they are forward-looking, are thinking and reacting not only to regulation today, but also regulation tomorrow. And so what you want is permanent, durable, politically durable regulation. And you want to be able to model how firms react differently to regulation that will be in place for a long time relative to a short time. Again, the dynamic machinery from IO helps us to do. And furthermore, with the careful firm level modeling, we're going to be able to simulate careful design of individual intervention programs. That's what the model is going to allow us to chase additionality and maximize the impact of our interventions. So now we're going to go from the firm level to the global level. And we're going to make the point that trade and migration shape the impacts of regulation. And the theme that's going to come up here is sort of rich general equilibrium forces that deforestation, again, is going to be a nice context to study. So we'll start with space then. Space coming from kind of spatial economics, talking about spatial interaction and how the activity of one farm impacts farms around it with spatial spillovers and spatial externalities. You see that in deforestation. You see that in deforestation, which is spatially concentrated. And so we see the arc of deforestation in Brazil and this frontier that moves, but in a sort of spatially concentrated way. That's deeply connected to kind of fire setting, which have spatial externalities. I set fire to slash and burn on my plot, but then it spreads to my neighboring plots. Deforestation is a setting where these spatial spillovers and spatial externalities are important. All of that happens within a country potentially. And so even within a country, you have this rich spatial element, which again, you can observe through the satellite data. You can see both that spatial heterogeneity. And if you want to go deep in that direction, you can model the spatial interaction with these tools from spatial economics. But then if we extend beyond the borders of a particular country, we also can highlight the important global perspective that comes in global general equilibrium, where regulation in Brazil, because Brazil is a large agricultural producer and exporter, that regulation in Brazil impacts Brazilian agricultural prices, which in turn impact global agricultural prices, and therefore, importantly, in general equilibrium, through this equilibrium force at global scale, regulation in Brazil impacts American farmers, Chinese farmers, Japanese farmers very far away. The trade models are going to allow us to kind of capture that rich equilibrium component of the impacts of regulation. Okay, so then what's nice about deforestation and deforestation data relative to the bread and butter computable general equilibrium modeling in trade? What is it that the focus on deforestation buys? Again, it comes down to the data at granular scale. Okay, so first off, the deforestation data are available globally, and so in a somewhat harmonized globally kind of way with comparable data across countries, one can now model at global scale how different countries are interacting with the same common set of data points. Okay, furthermore, again, because we observe deforestation at very granular scale, down to 30 meters by 30 meters, similar to the factory analogy in IO, when we're talking about trade, we no longer need to assume that every unit of production in China has 3 tons of carbon per unit of production, where we pull the 3 out of so hopefully some data, but sort of coarse data. There's a sense with the deforestation data, because they're measured at micro scale, we know on the margin where that next unit of production from Chinese agriculture is coming, because we've modeled agriculture across space in China and we measure agricultural activity across space in China. And therefore we know on the margin is the extra unit of agriculture coming from forested land, unforested land, heavily forested land. Okay, so again, the deforestation data, which are available at comparable global scale, give us a bit more data insight to enrich the kind of macro trade models with a bit more micro data. That's the value of the deforestation focus within international trade. To close this out, then there's a sort of smaller but important literature about global supply chains, which I think is very nice because it connects the local problem to global markets, local farmers to global markets in a very elegant way, making the point that global regulation has direct impact on local farmers, but those impacts filter through local market power, the power of large packaging, meat packers, for example, in Brazil. That's the focus of some of these papers down here. Again, the local is connected to the global in general equilibrium. Yes, please.
That point about the local and the global, and connected to Francisco's presentation earlier, what percentage of land in many of these forested areas is big commercial farms versus small farmers? I mean, like, what is the problem to focus on is really what I'm trying to ask.
It's an interesting question. It's a question that I often grapple with in Indonesia with my work on palm oil. So I know the statistics for Indonesia off the top of my head, so I'll focus the answer there. There, it's roughly 50% smallholders, 50% large agricultural conglomerates. In my own work, I punt on that a bit, partially because I'm not necessarily chasing after the smallholder, big farmer distinction. That's sort of less central to my paper on palm oil. And the way I punt on it there is to say, look, there is often vertical contracting by which the large farms provide the upfront capital to the small farms in exchange for having exclusive rights to the harvest. And so then with some market power, that vertical contracting basically means that the large companies extract all of the rents anyway. So it's kind of okay to model that kind of agricultural production as being the product of one decision maker in a way. So that's how I kind of smooth over those important complications in that particular palm oil paper. But this is great because it also reminds me, I'm sort of saying that deforestation is this fantastic, perfect data setting. There's one big flaw with the deforestation data, or one shortcoming, one pitfall, which is that you know this plot of land over here, is it deforested or not? A lot of trees, big trees, small trees, what kind of tree, we have all of that information. We know also for this plot of land, this plot of land. It is much more difficult to know that these three plots of land are connected under the same owner or not. And so as we move to local market power or monopoly power or kind of firm boundaries, that becomes much more difficult. Whereas if you were to go to the typical firm level survey data, the firm boundaries would be encoded in those survey measures. It's not with the satellite data. Okay, so the global scale and that spatial granularity does come at a cost, and that cost is usually going to be a bit more salient for these kind of IO studies where the boundaries of the firm are particularly. Thank you for the reminder. I meant to say that. Okay, so trade is about general equilibrium, rich general equilibrium forces. Deforestation is a place where the microdata allow us to kind of get a little bit more texture, granular texture on these equilibrium forces. Where do we go from here? Well, one kind of theme as we think about spatial spillovers, migration, and trade is that there may be unintended consequences of intervention and infrastructure investments and regulation. One, maybe we want to build roads into agricultural areas to support those local economies, but to the extent that there are spatial spillovers and long-run spatial spillovers, why? Because roads are durable. Then as we expand into certain areas, that's going to create spatial inertia. And now, even if there's strong regulation in those areas, the cost to deforest has gone down permanently because now it's very easy to access the trees and that agricultural land in that now kind of road invested area. And that's going to have an impact of accelerating the frontier, the expansion of the frontier. Okay, so a sort of unintended spatial consequence. Similarly, there's going to be an unintended global consequence as local regulation in a place that is a big agricultural producer reduces local demand and therefore reduces world demand and therefore reduces world prices and therefore encourages increased consumption of the agricultural product in unregulated foreign markets. Okay, as the EU regulates and pushes down its own demand, it brings down the world price. And so if China is unregulated, for the Chinese consumer, the lower world price is awesome. They're going to consume more. Their increase in consumption is partially going to offset the EU's decrease in consumption. And so there's going to be what we call leakage. Okay, the global response is going to undercut the local benefits of regulation, sort of unintended consequence. Okay, so these are spillover effects. So we know how to think about spillover effects. The way to deal with spillover effects as a regulator is to regulate in a coordinated way that accounts for those spillovers. So regional authorities can coordinate to internalize those spatial spillovers. And similarly, countries can, in principle, come together, write trade agreements, and coordinate on tariffs to minimize that. Okay, but the trade and spatial work highlights these unintended consequences. And what I want to emphasize here is that this kind of economic point that we notice translates directly into policy recommendations. From there, we can talk about political economy and political challenges. there are a number of papers really delving into the details of how local political incentives and political cycles affect deforestation, both globally and in particular country settings. And what that means is that, there's going to be this element of politics that I think is very central to how the regulator needs to think about regulation. To the extent, and in new work with Robin and Francisco and Veronica and Ben Olken, tomorrow I'll be talking about how we should think about the political resistance that potentially gets induced by regulation and what that means if that political resistance is so strong that it can lead to repeal of the regulation in the first place. That's a problem that is a dynamic problem. It's very related to the dynamics that Bard was talking about yesterday. This economics of doing nothing, and Bard talked about sort of time inconsistency, which is that the incentives tomorrow are different from the incentives today. And so in this setting with repeal, this is also fundamentally dynamic. If I press too hard today and I regulate up to the level of the externality today as the regulator, there's a problem, which is that tomorrow I might be kicked out and there's zero regulation tomorrow. That's also kind of an unintended consequence. That's also kind of a leakage phenomenon. That's the leakage of impacts today on impacts tomorrow. So we see the connection with trade. And then we see the connections also to IO. The impacts, actions today, having effects tomorrow, highlights the dynamics here. And the dynamic empirical machinery from industrial organization is well suited to help us think about these dynamic economic issues. And so where do we go from here? What we want to really think about is policy, agricultural policy, environmental policy, deforestation policy, conservation policy that is politically robust and durable. And I think we're living at a time now where that political durability we see is of first order importance. Deforestation is a nice place to continue to make progress on thinking about these issues of political robustness and durability. Again, because of that spatial granularity, the deforestation setting allows us to think in well quantified ways about distributional impacts, how some people win and some people lose. And of course, those distributional impacts and that unequal incidence of regulation is where these political frictions come from. Okay, deforestation allows us to measure that unequal incidence. And then more broadly, and I've heard Meredith Fowley say this many times among others, I think we also want to shift a little bit to really thinking about second best policies. Okay, the first best Pigouvian tax is the most efficient thing theoretically, but if it's not feasible, it's not feasible. If there are political constraints, then we shouldn't feel bad about not achieving that first best policy. And instead, we want to be developing a full menu of second, third, fourth, fifth best policies to understand, first off, just how much we're losing because of that political constraint. How does the second best compare to the first best? But also, this is the realistic set of policies that we can enforce. And so we want to go there. Please.
Within this politically robust setting, what's your view in the deforestation of the potential role of lobbying? Right, the supply chain point that you touched upon, I guess these meat packers or palm oil big exporters, they can exert endogenously a lot of political pressure for regulation, right?
Absolutely. And we'll actually be making exactly that point tomorrow in this paper that I'll be presenting, but that's exactly right. You have many actors within the economy that are impacted by regulation. Some of them have the ability to lobby against regulation in a coordinated way and to change whether regulation is enforced or not. And the high level takeaway from this political economy strain of the development and sort of deforestation literature is that we want to take those forces very seriously. We don't want to ignore them.
If I can just complement, these distribution effects may also affect small players. So it's not only the big money. The small money also may be losing.
The small players eventually cannot sway policy, right? That's the thing.
Through vote.
Oh, yes, you're right.
So with that, I'll just conclude, deforestation is central to our climate goals. We've made great progress. Again, we need more work in Africa, in the Congo rainforest in particular. We need more work on biodiversity. And as we think about next steps, both as academics and as policymakers, we want to think about what curbing deforestation means for and how it interacts with economic development. We want to really benefit from the new data, which includes scientific data and scientific models. And we want to really flesh out and fill out the set of policy tools that we can be thinking about for both local and global regulation. And we really want to emphasize political feasibility. And I think deforestation is a great context to be thinking about these questions. Thank you.
One question from online. So the claim was made at the beginning that national government policies in Brazil played a key role in reversing the deforestation trends. So someone asked are you confident in that claim? Is there good evidence supporting that it was because of policy and it wasn't because of some other external factors like commodity prices or other factors? So yeah, just something on that.
Francisco has the paper there, so
No, so the period where you have this reversal, it's actually a period where commodity prices are going down. And there is a lot of evidence on budget cuts from the environmental agents, from now I don't have from the top of my mind, but it's the enforcement organs entities, IBAMAs, etc. They have severe budget cuts on staff. And there are some policies changed giving amnesty for past deforestation even up until 2008, and this discussion is still going on of trying to pardon more the crimes. So I think there is some evidence that yes, there was enforcement weakened. There was a weakening on enforcement capacity from these regulations, even if formally they didn't change so much.
Is there much understanding of differences in kind of how ownership patterns change along with deforestation? Is a kind of, I don't know, common assumption that external players come in some way, acquire the land either by purchase or expropriation and then develop it, or is it more a case of the landowners in situ there just deciding to develop their land? And how do we think about differences in payment rates affecting those trends?
The short answer is I think that's a relatively open area, in part because of data constraints. This is a place where you really need to know who owns what farm. I can say it another way, which is I know if the tree got cut. I know we all know from looking at the satellite data, a particular tree, this one tree in this place, this latitude, this longitude, we know if it got cut or not. Who cut the tree is a different, important, but difficult question. And that's sort of the data that you need to kind of get at ownership angle. And there's another element here too, which is maybe you own, but you weren't the one who cut the tree. Maybe someone else cut the tree related to tenure. Yeah.
I can say something about Brazil. I think about 50% happens in public and designated land. I think about a quarter happens in settlements or ongoing land reform is happening. And about another quarter is private property, something like that. And it would change a lot from country to country, but a lot of it is in place. A very broad answer is a lot of it is in places where disputed property claims or less clearly defined individual property rights, but also a very large fraction happens in individually owned, well-defined property rights. Bit of everything.
Thank you. One of the things, I come from Uganda, sub-Saharan Africa, and what for me, it's interesting to discussion, but because the paper, the analysis looks more at large, mostly for me, large scale farming, but subsistence farming and small scale is very, very important as far as deforestation is concerned from our end. And that may impact also on the solutions that we're giving, because when you look at the incentives and what they may cause, what was presented first. So it's about, for us, maybe in future is more looking at those small scale farmers in detail and see what reactions can come. And if you give incentives, we are doing that, we're giving households money to increase. It's like seed money to increase household income. But what impact may have on deforestation is another key question, and the solutions. But also most important is the kind of land ownership is what also we should be able to think about. Where I come from in Uganda, land belongs to the people. So any person can do anything on this land, whereas there's the state. So these are things also to consider as deforestation comes out and get solutions. But at the end, when it comes to what can we do, because the point is raising productivity. And how do you raise productivity? I'm happy you talked about nature and biodiversity at the end. Probably you're going to use chemicals. What are you going to use? And this may impact more. So there's a lot of interplay and research that is needed here to talk about it, because we're talking about coverage. But what about happens about quality and biodiversity in there in terms of nature after can protect size? So these are things as you're presenting that came in my head. One of the things that may be missed, which didn't come about as a solution for me, is looking more at community practice and local solutions for bring down deforestation. Thank you. My points here.
Oh, very good. Anything to add?
Yeah. No, I think it's just on the biodiversity is like, no, I think we can talk to you.
I guess at a very high level, I sort of think about a little bit of a tension between the trade approach, which is the macro approach, and therefore gets these very rich, interesting general equilibrium effects, hopefully informed by micro data, but is able to capture kind of, local regulation in Brazil impacts the Chinese consumers. That's a real effect, and that's nice to capture. But then when you go global, and you go large scale, you capture these large scale general equilibrium effects, but then your modeling is less tailored to the individual settings. And then at the other extreme, you go super tailored, super custom made for this particular setting, getting every single institutional detail right. But then you always have this trade-off of not being able to get the global effects. And so it's always this kind of balance. And so those trade models are just not going to be able to capture this important first order richness. And that's sort of a different approach. But also,
it looks like the state has fairly strong rights to quite a lot of the land in both Brazil and Indonesia. So, people like Esteban Rossi Hansburg thinks that you could just strengthen the property rights, make them national parks or something. Then the evidence is that national park land, wherever you look, it's still deforested. So I guess the question is, what is the reason that doesn't happen? They're not getting enough payment for that, but it seems like that would be the obvious policy, right? You just say, okay, this is a no-cut area, because the value is not in the timber, it's in the continuation into something else.
Robin, you should say the answer is the political economy. That's the party line.
I guess, has any work been done on that about introduction or resistance to these things? Because the same with marine protection areas. These are just sort of no-go areas.
But from the top of my head, I think if the government demarks all unclaimed forests and say, this is my responsibility. No, it's your responsibility. You see, politically you are claiming and you have to enforce and everything. Unclaimed land, the government has less. Yeah. So I would imagine that we have some political issues on that, saying every unclaimed land, every non-private land, government claiming for itself and taking full responsibility for it. It creates some costs. I'll think it.
Political costs.
I'll think so.
Your last set of questions, maybe.
You can call me if I'm taking a long time. I can talk to you during the break, but I like the description on how the higher productivity can lead to intensification or expansion, and that will have different like opposite direction. And I have been thinking about this problem in the sense that is forest normal good or inferior good? So if you think like higher productivity means higher income, then do you want to increase, like, would the demand for the forest would go up or go down? And also considering the fact that forests give us a lot of different types of goods, like it gives us like timber or log, but also it gives us like some like leisure value, and that might react in the opposite direction if your income goes up or if your productivity goes up. So do you have any kind of like idea of, like, I guess it will depend on like relative elasticity of demand of these different forestry goods. So have you kind of thought about like which type of the good, forestry good would go up as a response to like higher productivity? Or is it like part of your story?
I mean, the Faruqi et al. Paper, who are co-author, Hater Pellegrina is a co-author on, kind of thinks about that. And then Jacob and I also have a paper coming out soon, hopefully, that also thinks about this kind of intensification versus expansion, local expansion versus global expansion kind of distinction.
I think question is very interesting because there is clearly what you just presented as this productivity paradox. Once you increase productivity, if you have high lands, like big lands, big farmers, they would actually have a bigger incentive, higher incentive to expand production in the forest. And that's precisely the case of Brazil. Most deforestation in Brazil does not happen with small farmers, but with big ones. So you have clearly a problem, which is the forest by itself does not worth too much. And if you cut it, it worth more than when it was standing. You have like clearly a market failure. How do you expect to address this sort of problems? Because if the increase of productivity, which will happen, no matter what the government wants, that's what the farmers will try to do. They will try to increase productivity. So the pressure of the forest will keep on going. How do you address this problem?
So I think it's related with the question of the gentleman in front of you. That's like, if you have vast amount of land, you become more productive. If nobody wants to buy your product, you don't expand. So if you are landlocked, if you have subsistence, local communities, cropping, even if you become more productive, if you don't have where to sell this product, you don't expand. The case like in Brazil, you're giving us this, like you become more productive and you have commodity like demand for soys and beef in the whole world. So then this creates pressure to expand.
So you mean like?
So then what you have to do is we have to think and do, need more research on it. It's on how can we pair increasing productivity, maintaining the agricultural frontier within reasonable limits.
I think we're out of time, but so you can have speakers more questions in the break. We're going to have a break now, and then we're going to be back in, I guess, slightly less than half an hour, where we can thank our speakers for a break.
Thanks.
Seriously, he's great.
I guess we're excited. Oh, and that's normal. The bad thing is that
Okay, so I have a model that allows me to calculate how much money in insurance and Malaysia. Regulation that. You know, tens of billions of dollars. Give up this property in order to help. And that's like.
Ma l'economia.
Os métodos que eu uso são bem, assim, bastante coisa bem matemática.
I was like, hey, here's the field. But I'll have everybody was nice.
That was a very good.
Yeah.
That was not.
Well, just I'm going to like this session. I'm still going to attend these two talks, but I guess 10 minutes before I have this. I straight to the. But it was really nice.
And unless the bank,
Laid out.
they're just not to make that phone.
The organization.
That's also.
Yes, no, yes, not me, but the other.
Within a city that has different universities.
Okay, thank you. We're gonna start our final session of the day. We have 3 papers, 30 minutes each. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nemit Shroff. The paper I'll be presenting is joint work with some of my colleagues at MIT. I'm from the MIT Sloan School, as well as colleagues at Stanford and the University of Toronto. So the question we ask in this paper is whether exposure to energy stocks and the ability to trade in such stocks affect people's beliefs about climate change, as well as their support for mitigation activity. Why do we ask this question? Well, climate change has turned out to be one of the most divisive issues of our time, and the people's opinions about climate change often split along partisan lines. Now, in polarized environments, the concern, the difficulty is the supply and demand of information is often slanted, and there's a tendency to distrust information that's provided, especially if it is inconsistent with somebody's priors. In such an equilibrium, it's very hard to shift, to get out of polarization, because people do not seek out new information or update with new information, even when there is scientific consensus. And absent some degree of consensus about climate change and how big of an issue this is, it's very hard to get policy support to do anything, or any support that comes does change from one administration to the next. So in this context, our argument, our hypothesis is that exposure to the stock market and opportunities to trade in energy sector stocks leads people to seek information about the value of the assets that they're endowed with. And this knowledge seeking encourages people to form their own beliefs about the underlying factors that affect the value of their assets. In other words, the process of deciding whether to buy, sell, or hold certain securities, certain stocks, leads individuals to learn about what factors affect the cash flows of these companies, of these stocks. And given that climate change and policies geared towards addressing climate change have a first order effect on the value of energy sector stocks, giving participants opportunities to trade in these energy sector stocks can lead people to learn about climate change and form their own beliefs about climate change. We think of this as sort of a free market, non-paternalistic approach to informing people, learning about climate change. The issue with testing our hypothesis is that generally decisions to own or to buy or sell a stock is endogenous to people's beliefs about climate change. And again, investments tend to be a function of people's individual characteristics, their financial literacy, which also correlate with people's beliefs and preferences with respect to climate change. So the approach that we take is we use a randomized control trial to address such concerns. And we did this leading up to the 2024 presidential election in the US, where climate change was one of the key policies that was being debated. So how exactly did we structure our experiment? Well, we conducted 2 parallel survey-based experiments. The first survey collected people's beliefs about climate change. We asked people a series of questions about to what degree do you believe climate change is a serious issue? To what degree do you believe human activities contribute to climate change, and so on and so forth. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. We also collected people's demographic details as well as information about what types of news they consume, about their political leanings, and a few other things. So there were 3 such surveys that were conducted. In parallel, we invited about 2/3 of the participants in our baseline survey. We randomly selected them to participate in a second set of surveys, which we call the financial market treatment. So 2/3 of these participants were invited to participate in this experiment, where we assigned about half of them green assets and half of them brown assets. So stock in a select few green companies and stock in a select few brown companies. We further split up these participants into those receiving $50 worth of assets and $100 worth of assets. And we included a third group where they received $0, but could trade with fantasy money, monopoly money worth $100. So the nature of this experiment, the nature of this financial market treatment was there was 6 weeks of trading. At the end of trading at the close of markets on Friday each week, participants could rebalance their portfolios. For the first 3 weeks, participants who were assigned to the green treatment arm could only trade within those green stocks. They could buy or sell green stocks. And the participants assigned to the brown treatment arm could only trade within the brown stocks. To ensure that people are engaged or to incentivize people to stay engaged, we said that if they did not respond to the trading survey, they would lose 10% of their portfolio value each week. So the way this was structured is we collected beliefs for everyone, but of these people, some of them were entered here, and we asked them to trade. As far as what the participants were concerned, they did not know that these studies are related. And I'll talk a little bit more about why we believe that ended up being the case. Okay. So the data we use to recruit participants comes from this company called Forthright. So if you're not familiar with this is a company which hires people, which basically incentivizes people to take surveys across a variety of different issues. So it's very common for participants on this platform to take multiple surveys each day. This is another reason why we don't necessarily think that these participants would connect the two sets of surveys that they were taking. Our baseline survey was conducted, the baseline belief survey was conducted between September 27th, 2024 until October 2nd. And then our trading survey started once the belief survey ended. We oversampled in states that were exposed to the energy transition as well as natural disasters. There were a couple of hurricanes that happened during our time period. And then we randomized participants into treatment and control groups. Our response rate was over 90%, but most importantly, there was no differential attrition across the different treatment arms that we had. So we included 3 brown stocks and 3 green stocks in our study, as well as 1 brown ETF and 1 green ETF. The way in which we selected these stocks was we wanted to make sure they were relatively large. The name had some association with either with being green or being brown. And they were profitable, because ultimately, if these stocks did extremely well. That was basically an option on our research budgets, which was a constraining factor. This figure just shows how these assets move during our study window. Of note is that once the election outcome came, we could see that all the green assets basically dropped in value significantly in anticipation of I think what was to come of US energy policy. The way our trading platform looked was something like this, where at the end of each week, so think of Friday at the end of each week, participants were told the value of their portfolio at the end of the week. They said what was the current value as well as what was the change in the value of their portfolio. It tells you that, okay, here are the stocks that this person has, here are changes in the value of the stock, as well as what was the overall gain or loss in that week.
Just one question on the, how do you want us to think about the brown versus green? Because I was thinking about your intro slide. I would have thought that like my incentives to learn about energy are kind of both exist in whether I have a brown or a green stock. It's more like, you know, if I had McDonald's, maybe I care less. But like within energy, I would have thought that in both cases, yeah, we still want to learn.
So the reason why we gave brown, you're exactly right. Your intuition is consistent with what we were thinking as well. The reason for giving brown and green stocks is to distinguish this learning mechanism from motivated beliefs argument. So this idea that if you're given green stocks, you're going to think more favorably about climate change, and if you're given brown stocks, you're going to think less favorably about climate change. The dollar amounts of the stock that we give is sufficiently small where motivated reasoning was not necessarily going to be the dominant mechanism at play. But that was, we wanted to separate out that idea from this broader experiential learning argument. So once you see this, then participants could rebalance their portfolio. So this you can see is after week 3, where they have access to all 8 assets, and they could rebalance their portfolio into any of these assets. Okay. Just to give you a sense for how trading behavior changed over the course of our study window, for the first 3 weeks, so the y-axis here represents the mean, the average percentage of an individual's portfolio in green stocks. So in week 1, people assigned to the green treatment arm have 100% of their portfolio in green stocks, and those assigned to the brown treatment arm have 0% of their portfolio in green stocks. Until week 3, this is by construction 0 and 100%. But as time passes over from weeks 4 to 6, you see that people who were initially assigned to the brown arm, they sell some of the brown stock and move towards green, and vice versa for those assigned to the green arm. But still, there is a default effect, which is consistent with the literature on defaults, that if whatever stock you're initially endowed with, you don't necessarily come out of it entirely. And what is also interesting is after the election, you see that both participants assigned to the green arm and the brown arm, they move towards brown stocks. The regressions that we estimate have the following form, where our dependent variable is one of several proxies for climate beliefs, as well as support for climate mitigation action. We use one index for parsimony, but I'll show you what that index is composed of. And most of analysis is split up based on the index components as well. We use lasso selected controls, where all responses to our baseline survey was included in the lasso. And then we include block fixed effects to control for other demographic characteristics. The dependent variable is an index of the following 9 categories of climate beliefs. So one is this broad category of questions. We used a 7-point Likert scale of the extent to which people agree or disagree with statements of the following nature. These are paraphrased, I've tried to condense it, but things like climate change will seriously impact the US quality of life. Human activities cause climate change. Climate change is not a serious issue. So a second category called transition benefits. So renewable energy creates well-paying jobs. Investments in renewables fights climate change. Transition to renewable benefits the economy. transition cost, sort of the inverse of this, where renewable energy will threaten jobs in the US. Renewable energy will take up land that would be used for other causes. It might not efficiently meet US energy needs. Support for government action. So primarily two questions. Should the US do more? The US government do more to reduce emissions, and the US should act only if other countries, particularly India and China, act. Again, these are condensed versions of it. They were spelled out more clearly in our survey. Support for business action. So basically the same thing with government action, but should US companies do more? Climate policy salience. So questions like, of many possible policy concerns like immigration, climate change, strengthening the economy, improving healthcare. Where do you think climate change falls in terms of importance? Pro-climate behaviors, like you're going to sign a climate petition, join an environmental group. Climate decisions in terms of this climate influence, where you decide to work, live, and invest, as well as a willingness to pay measure, which is called climate donation, which is people who entered into a lottery where they were said that, okay, if you won this $50 or $100, you could either keep the money for yourself or you could donate to one of three causes, where one of the options was a climate cause. So we saw to what extent people are willing to donate some amount of money to a climate cause. Just to give you a sense for how these beliefs line up, we're based on political leanings. It's largely what you'd expect. So with respect to climate beliefs, you see that the red line represents the beliefs of those identifying as Republicans, blue line for Democrats, and then the gray line, which is hard to see here, is independents. You see that Republicans are generally more skeptical of climate change, whereas Democrats tend to agree more. Independents are somewhere in between. And you see this basically across the board. So across all 9 categories of questions, we see these patterns hold up, which gives us some comfort that we're picking up the broader sentiment of what we observe from other surveys of different issues in the US. So this is our main result. The dependent variable here is the overall index of climate beliefs. And we estimate this regression of the index of climate beliefs on an indicator variable for whether you were assigned to this financial treatment arm, which combines everything from whether you were in the real asset group and the fantasy asset group. So you're comparing the beliefs of those assigned to the treatment arm to the control, to the 1/3 that were in the control sample. And we estimate this regression both for beliefs collected during the midline survey as well as beliefs collected during the endline survey. And what we find is that exposure to energy sector stocks leads to 0.65 increase, standard deviation increase in the extent to which participants agree with the statements that composed our overall index. When we break this treatment down into those assigned to real assets and fantasy assets, we see that much of the action happens to those assigned real assets. And whether you were assigned $50 or $100 doesn't seem to make much of a difference, because you don't find anything meaningful there. And then further, when we break this down into those assigned to the green treatment arm and the brown treatment arm, here again we see that regardless of whether you were assigned green stocks or brown stocks, you become more agreeable with statements included in our climate index. So our interpretation of these results is that exposure to energy sector stocks leads people to seek knowledge about factors that affect the value of these stocks, of which climate change and climate policy is a big component, and that leads people to learn and update their beliefs.
Did you also include a knowledge index in the survey?
So yes, by knowledge, do you mean
climate knowledge, any sort of?
Yes, so I'll show you what exactly we did.
Just walk me through, perhaps I didn't get it. What is the difference? Why the channel is not picked by the fantasy assets? Why do they not learn with those and with the real assets they do?
Our sense is, I think, the incentive or the willingness, the extent to which people are engaged in collecting information is requires some financial component to it.
I see.
So
that makes sense,
That is our sense. So coming back to your question, we're trying to get at the mechanism, right? And see whether the evidence is consistent with learning or something else. So our thoughts, like our specific idea is that people exposed to treatment, they're going to change their media consumption to tilt towards understanding the value of these stocks, particularly the knowledge of the environmental impact of their stock, as well as broader measures of financial literacy. And we try to test all of these all three mechanisms, as well as shut down certain alternative mechanisms related to motivated reasoning, as well as salience. So what do we do here? So one of the questions in our survey is, where do you get your news from this week? Okay, so we asked this both in the trading survey as well as the belief survey. And you're given a variety of different options here. That includes both financial news as well as traditional media and social media. And what we find is that those in the treatment sample, particularly those assigned real assets relative to those in the control arm, they become more likely to consume financial news, both at midline as well as endline. And the magnitude increases from midline to endline. Simultaneously, they became less likely to rely on social media, as well as, I would say, partisan news channels. So think of Fox News as well as some of the major networks. This is sort of the mechanism we have in mind.
One interpretation of this seems like it could be that you incentivize people to consume less biased news. Is that part of the story you're thinking about, or?
In essence, but not necessarily. I mean, there are political leanings even within the financial news outlets, right? But the thought is to consume more financial news. And I think less social media news also helps, right? Because there it's social media, the way in which algorithms work, they're often an echo chamber. So that is, in some sense, what we think of the mechanism. One other thing I forgot to mention with here is the idea that the economic magnitudes is systematically larger at endline relative to midline is also consistent with increased prolonged exposure to trading leading to belief revision. So it's all consistent with this learning argument. At the end of our 6th trading survey, we also asked this open-ended question as to what did you learn from this study? So just give you some descriptive examples of how people responded. So these are just a select few, but there are many more like this. So some of them said, like, I learned a lot about clean energy and CO2 emissions, information that I did not know previously about their carbon emissions, their emissions. There are a number of factors that can increase or decrease the value of stock prices. The election was important to future energy stock prices. I learned that solar and coal power investments perform in different directions. Go ahead.
Just as an ask, what did you tell them was the point of the study?
So we asked them what it was. Our sense was majority of them thought it related to some sort of stock market investing thing. That was it.
So you don't think that they were like this, they thought it was a study about learning about clean energy and they just told you that was what
nothing that we could see suggested that. So we entered these the responses here into ChatGPT to see what people learned. Vast majority of them said they learned something. And what did they learn about? Well, they learned about stock market investing. Some of them learned about the energy and environment. Very few people thought that this related to beliefs in climate change, the way in which we would think about the main objective of our study. One of the other parts of this is we wanted to see whether people's beliefs about whether their financial literacy changes. So these are standard questions that other studies have used to assess financial literacy. One relates to diversification, two other questions relate to time value of money. And we just wanted to see whether people become more financially literate after exposure to this 6 weeks of trading. And what we find here again is people, those in the treatment arm become 0.67 standard deviations more likely to get these questions related to financial literacy correct after 6 weeks of trading. And then those that receive real assets have a higher economic magnitude than those that are assigned fantasy assets. And this primarily happens again in end line after 6 weeks of trading rather than 3 weeks of trading. Third question that we asked is just information about the emissions of the 6 stocks that were included in our study. So the way we structured this was, in your opinion, how many tons of CO2 equivalent annual greenhouse gas emissions do each of these companies produce? And if you're not sure, please provide your best guess. And we will select one respondent who answered most accurately to receive a $100 prize. We were concerned that people would just Google the answer, but I mean, that's where presumably those in the treatment arm and those in the control arm similarly likely to cheat. And the options were less than 1,000, less than 100,000, less than 1 million, less than 1 billion, more than 1 billion. So order of magnitude difference in answers. And here at end line, what we see is those assigned to treatment were 18.5, 0.185 standard deviations more likely to answer these questions correctly relative to those in the control arm. And those assigned the real asset treatment were again more likely than those in the fantasy asset treatment to get the answers correct.
Did you do some heterogeneity by political affiliation?
We did, so our initial prior was that Republicans were more likely to move their beliefs than Democrats. What we find, this is preliminary, we're still working on this, is that the belief revision for both Democrats and Republicans actually happens about the same, by about the same magnitude. One other thing that we tried is whether people who are more skeptical at baseline with respect to climate beliefs, whether they were more likely to move, because ultimately you want their beliefs to change, and we do find evidence in support of that.
Is there any heterogeneity in the policy salience that they felt? Like if maybe they want action on climate change, but they just don't think it's feasible, so they don't think that the green companies are going to.
We looked at the different components. Of the 9 components, the policy salience was actually the one place where we saw the least effect. The part where we saw the most action was the overall climate belief, as well as support for government action, support for business action. I would say those actually persisted for a while. The last part of this is we try to understand how long these effects persist, because is our belief revisions restricted to the period of the study, or do they actually last longer? So we conducted a follow-up survey of those who participated in our belief survey 8 months after the endline survey to see if the results persist. And here, I guess it depends on your priors. So if you look at other interventions that are aimed at persuasion, aimed at belief revision, most of these effects, even the ones related to, say, if you live in a hurricane-prone area, are you more likely to change your beliefs about climate change? Those seem to be temporary. So you're interested to see whether the effect of such treatment was similarly temporary or whether it actually persisted for a longer term. And if you look at the overall action, so most of this was pre-registered. If you look at the overall climate index, we do find that the economic magnitude substantially reduces. It was 0.065 standard deviations in endline for those in the real asset treatment at endline. That reduces to 0.28 standard deviations, and the statistical significance is now at the one-tailed 10% level significant. The sample size is smaller here, so I think we had a response rate of about 78% of those in our endline survey. So the power of these tests is a little bit lower, but we were pleasantly surprised that these effects persisted even after 8 months when people had divested of these stocks, and for all intents and purposes, it moved on to other things. If you look at what components of our index actually help contribute to this overall index, it relates to transition benefits, the support for government action, as well as self-reported influence of climate on life decisions. So this is where we saw the effects to persist the longest. Okay. There's a lot more that we do, but I'll just focus on some of the key things. Our main point of this study was to say that exposure to energy sector stocks, as well as opportunities to trade in them, help change people's beliefs about the impact of climate change and their support for mitigation action. And the mechanism through which this stock exposure seems to work is increased consumption of financial news and reduced consumption of, let's say, social media. Okay. So this is from a quote from back in the day, where just highlighting the importance of reducing polarization, of getting broader public support to get any change in policy. So this is Abraham Lincoln. In this age, in this country, public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Against it, nothing can succeed. Whoever molds public sentiment goes deeper than those who enact statutes or pronounces judicial decisions. Yeah, so the extent that's still relevant, we think the findings over here are important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers, both PhD students and faculty. It's an amazing event. I'm Guglielmo. This is a joint work with Ravi Vora, who's at the University of Wyoming, where we're going to be thinking about the endogeneity of environmental policy preferences. Traditionally, in a standard economic framework, individuals choose and vote for policies based on their own personal cost and benefit, or on the economic merits of the policies, such as cost effectiveness, efficiency, dynamic incentives, distributional implications, and so on. For voters, however, evaluating a policy before its implementation can be challenging. While we are used to, as economists, to think about ex post policy evaluation using standard causal empirical analysis or modeling tools, for voters, fully understanding a policy before it's actually being implemented, it can be challenging and therefore lead to ex-ante bias beliefs about the policy and therefore some sort of aversion towards policies that they are not familiar with. And so if as environmental economists, we're used to think about carbon tax as a leading example of an environmental policy that garners relatively low public support, in fact, there's a number of other environmental policies, both market-based and non-market-based, that at the beginning, at the early stage of their implementation, have been relatively controversial with relatively low public support. And so for this reason, despite being heavily recommended by economists, practitioners, and scientists, there are many environmental policies that are not implemented by policymakers because they feel, in fact, prevented by this relatively low ex-ante popularity. And so traditionally, when we think about preferences, these are modeled to be as exogenous, fixed, and invariant to the policies, the past policies that have been implemented. However, it might well be the case that if policies are in fact implemented, individuals familiarize with them and might change their social and cultural norms and update their beliefs and therefore reshape their policy preferences. And this in fact, endogeneity of policy preferences is a phenomenon that has already been documented in the political economy literature with respect to a number of institutions and policies. Think about the exposure to the political economic system in East Germany between 1945 and 1990, or also the exposure to democratic institutions, or the so-called successful democratic institutions in terms of political stability, economic growth, and peace.
And so what we're going to think about in this paper is try to understand whether empirically the same pattern holds for environmental policies and exposure to the implemented environmental policies in shaping subsequent environmental preferences. And as a matter of fact, from an anecdotal perspective, there is evidence that suggests that policy preferences, environmental policy preferences, evolve as a function of policies that have either been implemented or have failed to be implemented. And so I'm going to show you a couple of cases from a very anecdotal visual inspection motivation that suggests that this pattern is at play here. The first example I'm going to show you here is the implementation of the carbon tax in British Columbia in 2008. And you can see from a very simple time series plot of the average share of opposition towards carbon tax, how that steadily decreased over time in British Columbia by more than 20 percentage points after the implementation of a carbon tax. Suggested again, initially very unpopular environmental policies, but more than 60% of the opposition in the region towards carbon tax has been steadily decreasing in a time range of like 5 to 7 years after the implementation of that policy. Preferences seem to evolve not only once policies are implemented, but also, and of course in the opposite direction, once policies fail to be implemented. And so this is in fact what we observe in France, thanks to 2 different studies that have been eliciting preferences and support for a carbon tax with public rebates in early 2019, where support was around 38% in the French population. And you can see that after the 2019 cancellation of the fuel tax, in a survey that was conducted in 2021, which had in fact a broader geographic scope, but just focusing in case on France, you can see that again, the share of support for the same policy decreased by 28%. So again, in just a 2-year time span, there's a 10 percentage point decrease in the popularity of the carbon tax once in fact it failed to be implemented. And so what we're gonna, with these sort of 2 motivating facts, what we're gonna try to understand is whether at a much broader scale, we can document empirically this pattern of endogeneity of environmental policy preferences as a function of the exposure to past environmental policies. Yeah.
So just on those 2 measurement facts, which are really interesting statistics, are there any studies that do this where you've got the pre-existing trends?
I don't think there is. It's a great point, and so this is I don't think there is any
changing.
So I mean, this is a pre-trending to the extent that this is early 2019, right? So this is before the announcement of the fuel tax being cancelled in France, which was around September in that same year.
So you've got a data point before and a data point afterwards. My point is there's a lot of sales change.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, this is right. That's the reason why we are sort of thinking about this motivating anecdotal evidence. And as far as I'm aware of, this is not the data that we're using, but I'm not aware of any other survey asking about this question in France so that we can track sort of a longer time series. Yeah, Patrick.
As a BC resident, I have to point out that
No,
we
but
don't have, not in here, but we don't have a carbon tax anymore. And so, well, one, in answer to Claire's question, there should be survey data, both during the carbon tax period and post. So that may help.
So you're referring to British Columbia now, right?
And well, in all of Canada, right? Because the whole.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, I thought your question was about France.
It applies
Or
to
in
both
general.
of these.
Yeah.
But then I guess second, you may want to think about how to like tweak this motivation a little bit, given the recent Canadian experience.
Yeah.
So we can talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Point well taken. Thanks. Again, these are just sort of motivating facts, and we can talk about maybe better ones. And I'm also eager to hear more about like even more in the long run. But what we're thinking about here is even from a broader scale, and we're going to be using global, or to some extent, whatever 38 countries mean in the world, survey data, and combine it with a harmonized measure of environmental policy stringency, and then dive into the different sort of dimensions of different policies instruments. And what we're going to be thinking about here is exploiting within country year across birth cohort variation in the exposure to environmental policy stringency, effectively accounting for age, cohort, and country year observed heterogeneity. And our baseline finding is that, in fact, exposure to more stringent environmental policies does increase public support for environmental policy at the time of the interview. And this is fairly, and it's particularly driven by a specific time window of individual's lifetime, the so-called formative age or impressionable years, which is the time window of an individual's age between 18 and 25 years old, which is a well-posited and well-documented hypothesis in the social psychology literature. And so these findings have particularly important implications for policymakers because they seem to suggest that this sort of like opposition to certain environmental policies that is documented in the data might only be short-lasting, and it might not be reflecting long-lasting preferences of individuals. And this is sort of what we try to even just shed light in our paper with some counterfactual that I briefly summarize. Yeah, Alan.
In the intro, you also had this really interesting point about policies that got proposed but didn't go through, and then that actually had a negative effect. But I guess that's a little bit different.
It's a little bit different to the extent that we cannot, in fact, the policy implementation is an equilibrium outcome, so we're not able to look at those failed policies. That's why, again, this is purely motivation, like anecdotal. We're gonna think about this, the 2019 fuel carbon tax in France exercise, but this is not capturing the data to that extent, right? And there was someone else. Yeah, Bruno.
Can you separate this exposure to environmental policies to broad policies overall? I don't know. If, for instance, environmental stringency is more associated to don't know, left-wing policies or right-wing policies, it doesn't matter.
100%.
Right? But if there is, can you separate whether it's exposition to this specific or just
we have
broad?
some exercises. We have some exercises both sort of on the placebo, so altering our X treatment, and also on the as a falsification, showing that in fact non-environmental policy preferences and sort of do not respond to environmental policy stringency, suggesting that again these are not changes that are reflected in sort of broader economic or societal changes. All right, again, I'm just gonna be walking you through sort of like the empirical results. We have sort of a model that I briefly touched upon just in words that sort of tries to rationalize these results, but the empirical exercise is, of course, combined of two main data sources. We are using global survey data that ask environmental policy preferences for 38 countries in the past for around 25 years period between 1990 and 2014. These 38 countries are heavily focused in Europe. We have a fairly good coverage of Europe and mostly I would say OECD countries all over the world. So again, this is a relatively middle income and high income countries overall. The two questions that we're going to be using to measure environmental policy preferences are asked in a Likert scale. We're going to be using the support for government intervention to reduce pollution at no personal cost. It is particularly important for some additional results that I'll show you later, and the preference for a tax increase to prevent environmental pollution. Standard survey data will be using and collecting information also at the individual level on standard covariates, some dimensional heterogeneity, and as I was mentioning before, also some non-environmental aptitudes to try and test for some as a potential falsification exercise. In terms of environmental policy stringency, again, given the broad scope of our analysis to sort of that we really are interested, first of all, in sort of documenting empirically this pattern, we're going to be using the environmental policy stringency index developed by the OECD, which sort of harmonizes in a comparable way environmental policy instruments that have been implemented throughout in all the countries that we have in the sample in the past 30 years. Stringency is defined as this explicit or implicit price that is put as part of the implemented environmental policy in order to on polluting or environmentally harmful behavior. This is sort of course, out of a black box. There are in fact 13 environmental policy instruments, which can be categorized into the first three standard broad groups that we think about: market-based policies, non-market-based policies, and both upstream and downstream technological support, thinking about R&D support or also feed-in tariffs and actions. There's a standardized index that ranges from 0 to 6. And just to give you an idea, this is sort of the country-specific time series over time, country-specific time series of this index from 1990 to 2020. I am highlighting here 3 different cases: Sweden, the US, and Brazil, which are also those 3 countries that I'm going to be using later on in my counterfactual exercises, and are somewhat reflective also in a fairly stereotypical way, I suppose, a relatively more stringent policy environment, relatively lax, and somewhat very close to, in fact, our cross-sectional mean.
Sorry if I missed it. So these environmental policies, for example, in Brazil, it's not deforestation policy, it's.
There is not deforestation, that's a, yeah.
Clean air.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
CO2.
These are correct, yeah, mostly, yeah.
So pollution and greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, I mean, there's also like some, yeah, but yeah, exactly, it's mostly this two pollute, yeah, externalities, yeah, that's correct. Okay, so our empirical exercise, I suppose you all guess by now, is aims at estimating the effect of exposure to past environmental policy on current individual environmental preferences. In order to do that, we're going to be regressing individual level survey information and responses to, in terms of environmental policy preferences for an individual born in year B, in country C interviewed in year T, in survey wave W. We're going to be taking the most simple approach, which sort of accumulates the environmental policy stringency exposure as the unweighted average of the history of environmental policy that an individual has been exposed to from year 18. Of course, we play around with that threshold up to the year of interview and account for both individual level covariates and country birth year of interview covariates, in particular of those most important potential confounders, which are environmental quality and economic conditions. Now, our specification accounts for a battery of fixed effect at the birth, country year, survey fixed effect level, and also country-specific age linear trends. Because of the high use of high dimensional fixed effect, I'm just going to be walking you through one by one of what each of these dimensions effectively purges out and what is our residual variation. So first of all, as you've seen, although policy stringency ebbs and flows over time, there is some sort of non-stationarity in the positive trend in the policy stringency. So there is some sort of spurious probability that younger cohorts are exposed to relatively more stringent policies. We effectively account for birth year fixed effect, and we have additional robustness where we demean our policy levels before computing the exposure, or even fit country-specific linear trends in the environmental policy stringency level before computing our exposure measure. Most importantly, we account for country year of interview fixed effects. So this effectively purges out any country-specific shock at the time of the interview, and we will just be comparing individuals within the same country year who differ by the birth cohort they belong to. There's also potential concerns about generational trends in environmental preferences across countries, which we account for country-specific linear age trends. And again, of course, the only level of variation that we cannot account for the fixed effect is just going to be our birth country year of interview level. And so we just control for potential observable confounders, which we measure through environmental quality and economic conditions. Our survey fixed effect just account for potential differences in sampling methodologies between the two survey sources. And so just to...
Just one question. Thinking about your amazing beliefs paper, do you want us to think about the outcome here as just preferences, or is also like you're learning that policies can be implemented?
Yeah, I'm gonna briefly touch upon that when I talk about the model, where we try to talk about like whether the exact mechanism is like more learning or changes in the individual utility primitives and like reshaping cultural and social norms, but I'm gonna just try to defer that. But we are trying to think about here as policy preferences, short answer. And so with all this battery of fixed effect, I'm just going to show you visually now what these do, in fact, through these two bin scatter plots. On the right-hand side, I am showing you the raw partial correlation between our environmental policy stringency exposure and our main outcome being the preferences for government intervention to reduce pollution. And you can see this negative significant correlation between these two variables when we just pool the observations all together and look at the raw cross-sectional pooled correlation. Now, once we actually residualize with all our fixed effects, both outcome and treatment, you can see that we see this strong positive correlation. And so this is already kind of a preview of our baseline findings that I'm now showing you in tabular forms here that suggest that being exposed to more stringent environmental policies increases support at the time of the interview for environmental policies. In terms of magnitude, you can think about one standard deviation increase in policy stringency exposure, increasing by 0.2 standard deviation the support for government to reduce pollution. This might not be really helpful. So what we do is do sort of a thought experiment where we think about increasing the stringency from the US level to the Sweden level in 2019, and this would correspond to around a 6% increase in the Likert scale support. Again, this is just, the average sort of treatment in our black box index. So what does this mean in terms of like heterogeneity across different policy instruments that I'm exposed to, which might drive different perceptions in terms of cost burden or incidence. So we are trying to dive a little bit more into this by unpacking our index. So when we look at the effect on preferences for government intervention, there is not a lot of heterogeneity. If anything, the effect is slightly would be significant, but again, not different really when we think about non-market-based policies, which again suggest, remember the question asking about preferences for increasing government intervention at no personal cost, and again, thinking about this mapping with respect to non-market-based policies that have not really additional personal cost. Things become much starker when we look at the impact on tax preferences. And so here again, I'm showing you the coefficient associated with different measures of the policy stringency by different sort of sub-indices. And you can see that the effect is only driven by exposure to more stringent environmental taxes, and in particular, carbon and fuel tax. Sorry, Marion was the first one, yeah.
So actually, this is surprising because my question was around heterogeneity by how salient the benefits of these policies are, and I had in mind that between local sources of pollution and global like CO2 emissions, maybe you have time to experience the benefits from their air quality policies. So I was wondering if you try to split this way instead of the market.
Yeah, right. I see what you mean. Yeah, it could be a good. Yeah, we could think about that. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, and then
do you have any information on whether the households in the survey are rural or urban households? Because a lot of those policies will mostly affect
100%. I don't think that's a margin that we can exploit. We exploit some others, and short story, there's not really a lot of heterogeneity. There's some more in terms of political interest and political engagement of the individuals that I'm happy to talk to you about later. But
and for the US sample, do you observe states?
I don't think so. I have to double check. Yeah,
because those policies will be
right. There's a state level variation. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah. Carl.
This distinction is really interesting. I mean, you say no personal cost. I mean, I guess in the sense that it doesn't show up on a budget or a spreadsheet. Right. I mean, what do we know about the extent to which people are aware that standards impose costs or get angry at standards just as they might get angry at a tax?
Yeah, I think we do want, I guess, also both from an economic but also statistical point of view, take with a grain of salt. There is in fact no statistical difference between those two coefficients. So I think that this is just suggestive. I think here things are a little bit more convincing, both in the way the outcome is formulated is really asking about a support for an increase in tax, and the way that the effect really seems to be driven fully by tax stringency. And again, this is particularly important because, again, we can also think about the magnitudes and suggest that there's been a lot of work focusing on the skepticism, especially in the short run, towards carbon taxes. And again, this might suggest that over time, in fact, this might evolve in a positive endogenous way. I've been mentioning about exposure in different time of their life that might have heterogeneous effects, and this is what we test here. And so what I'm showing you here is not anymore the lifetime exposure to policies, but in fact exposure in specific 8-year age windows that range from 10 to 17 up to 1673. And you can see that in fact it's really the formative age exposure that drives the effect with a magnitude that is very similar to our baseline, suggesting that there is no really effect of getting smaller as individuals accumulate information over time, maybe leading back to somebody who was asking back at the information channel. Yeah.
Are these different regressions?
They are. We don't observe an individual for 63 years in the data.
But I mean, the samples are different in each of these coefficients, or no? We have age-specific coefficients?
No. They are literally what is that? Eight different regressions. There might be some overlap in the sample to the extent that we observe an individual's lifetime, an individual's exposure both at the very early, for example, in two of them. So there is some overlap. I wouldn't know off the top of my head how much of that overlap is, but yeah, these are different. Again, so you wouldn't want to compare.
I guess somehow the distribution is balanced, right? It's not that you have 70%.
Oh, 100%. I mean, this is survey data there, stratified across age. So the population within a country across ages is representative of that. Could be what?
There'd be cohort effects rather than age effects.
So we do have,
There's something about those,
right.
that generation that you see in your data at that age.
Right. Remember, our specification has both cohort fixed effects, country specific age linear trends, and country year. So we in fact account for what is the sort of cohort age cohort year tension in quantitative sociology. Yeah. All right. So with all of this in mind, sort of like, and to take stock, we try to understand how much of this pattern that we documented before in the environmental political process, Patrick?
So I just have a question still on the results.
Yeah.
You have this result in the appendix that's like a null effect on left versus right wing, which is actually pretty surprising, right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe some of this is getting sucked out in the fixed effects, but what we know about the formation of these preferences is that they're like strongly identity based. You think of yourself as a green voter. So I'm wondering, is there a way you can like press more on that, or maybe it's just like worth highlighting, because I think a lot of people might expect that. Yeah.
It's a good point. What I'm gonna just raise, I guess, as a point of like thought, is that this is still it would be an heterogeneous treatment effect, but pooled across countries. So one might want to also to dive in. I think that to the extent that, again, we're mostly covering middle income and high income countries, there might still be some. I think that when we're thinking about polarization, we do have, like, at least I think of the US, for example, maybe it's less obvious, for example, in Europe or in some countries in Europe and so on. So maybe that might be behind it, but diving into country specific age and political orientation specific coefficients maybe might,
Could you code policies that are passed by the party that you favor versus policies that are passed by the party that you don't favor?
I would have to think more about that, but in principle, I think so. Yeah, that's a good point. John?
I'll just echo my co-author that it would be easier for me to understand the paper if there were more of an articulation of exactly what variation is driving this. You have a very compelling argument for why all the fixed effects need to be there, but then I'm left wondering, like, what is it that's generating this variation in exposure after we've pulled out so much of the variation?
Right. The easy way to think about this is you and I being interviewed in the same year in the same country and just belonging to these different birth cohorts, and that is the residual variation detrended from the fact that we have different ages.
Yeah, and just like as a share of the total exposure environmental variation, is that a very small share or a big share?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, point well taken. Okay, I'm just gonna conclude again and wrap up to think about very simple counterfactual exercise, which sort of tries to aims at trying to help us think about like how important this pattern is and what would happen if individuals were exposed to a counterfactual policy level. And so again, as I'm gonna take our sort of leading examples and run 3 different policy counterfactuals and think about Brazil, United States, and Sweden, and sort of treat each cohort in each year in which they were interviewed with a different policy based on Brazil's, US, and Swedish policies to agency exposure, and we're gonna predict the counterfactual change in the strong support for green policies. And so what I'm showing you here is for different histograms of, again, the share of strongly supporters of government intervention as observed in data, and then under 3 different counterfactors. And again, because of this positive endogeneity that we documented in data, you can see that clearly the more stringent the policy exposure that an individual is exposed to, the more the higher the share of the supporters for green policies. And again, if one wants to make the sort of heroic assumption of a one-to-one mapping between our stated preferences and revealed preferences and a majority voting rule, you can see that there would be 9 countries in our sample that under the Swedish policy counterfactual would have public support above 50%. So this is important in a sense because these are potential policies that could be approved under another counterfactual and therefore set in motion this dynamic loop of more stringent policies, which is going to drive more higher support in the future. So just to wrap up, this paper shows that,
Maybe just in terms of interpretation of your results, how do you reconcile that with the growing backlash against climate policy in pretty much every country in which they are implemented?
Yeah, 100%. This is exactly, this sort of helps bridge a bit the conclusion in a sense that we do see this sort of strong substantial opposition and backlash in the short run, But in fact, this again, it might be that if policymakers were to take a little bit more of a paternalistic approach, perhaps and experiment a little bit with those policies, then individuals might familiarize with these policies. And we have a model in our paper that sort of tries to rationalize these results. We have two coexisting mechanisms. One could be a simple endogenous learning by the policy being implemented and familiarizing with that. And the other one that gets a little bit more about the utility primitives of the individuals through a sort of reference point type of a model. We also suggest, we don't like, I take always this with a little bit of caution, but we try to propose an empirical test that to test for this endogenous learning hypothesis. The idea is that the higher the level of variation in the policies, so we exploit second moments and other measures of experimentation of policy, and we show that this does not seem to predict support, so that sort of leads us to think to support the latter mechanism as the one that rationalizes our results. But the basic idea is really thinking about potentially policies that practitioners and economists suggest that might be unpopular in the short run. In fact, if implemented, could set in motion this dynamic familiarization changes in the preferences themselves, therefore it might increase support in the long run. And with that, I'm done, so I'm going to take Jeff's question.
I may have got this wrong, but like, so this formative years cohort, that's just at one point in time though, right? But like, once they get to the 26 to 33 range and older, do they then go back down? Or are they always treated in that level?
No, so the idea is that, sorry, maybe I wasn't clear. So this means, what I'm looking at here is, what was the level of policy that you were exposed to when you were 18 to 25? But I might be interviewing you when you are 26 as much as when you are, well, again, we have 25 years of, so probably like, yeah, you're probably 50, the oldest you can be in our sample. Yeah.
Yeah, when I'm thinking about the stringency index, should I think about this as number of policies or how effective one?
No, it's actually it's a matter of like the well, it's both, right? Extensive and intensive margin. So, for example, for those countries that have a carbon tax in place, it also like reflects and harmonizes the price associated with it. All right, thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for the organizers for this wonderful conference. And thanks for staying for this very last session of the day. So this is joint work with Ondine Berland, who's also here in the room, and my name is Marion Leroutier. So the motivation for this paper is that we know that we need drastic carbon emission reductions in order to comply with global climate targets. But at the same time, we have a problem of low climate policy support. And the recent backlash that we've seen a lot of climate policies suggests that this is particularly the case in the current time period. What we know from the literature is that one very important determinant of public support for climate policy is the perceived or the actual individual costs of this policy. So there has been a lot of work trying to understand better which groups of individuals are most likely to bear a higher burden from climate policy. And relatedly, there has been a lot of work trying to understand the current heterogeneity in a contribution to carbon emissions. A lot of this work has actually focused on income as a very relevant dimension in order to understand the distributional consequences of climate policy. But we also know that there is a lot of within income heterogeneity in climate policy costs and current carbon footprints. So we think that gender could be a relevant, but so far quite overlooked dimension of this heterogeneity, given well-documented differences in consumption between men and women. And this is like the second motivation for this paper, which is best illustrated with this two advertisements that emphasize the correlation between some very carbon-intensive goods and traditional male identity. So on the right-hand side, you can see this McDonald's commercial in China that emphasizes that eating a cheeseburger is, this 100% manly man behavior. And on the left-hand side, or right, I mean, right, yeah, you know, for you it's right-hand side, you can see this Toyota advertisement that was very controversial that emphasizes that this Toyota 4Runner is made for men. Besides this kind of gender stereotypes on consumption, there are also other factors such as gender differences in labor market integration or intra-household allocation of tasks that explain why men and women differ in terms of their food and transportation choices. And this justifies looking at whether these differences translate into meaningful gender differences in carbon footprints. And I emphasize here food and transportation because these are the two sectors that we're going to look at in this paper, where in a nutshell, what we're going to do is to first quantify the gender gap in carbon footprints for food and transportation based on data from France. So we're going to link a detailed consumption survey for these two sectors with a very granular product level emission intensity in order to build individual level carbon footprints. And we're focusing on food and transport because we have individual level data for these sectors, but they also represent for the average households more than half of their carbon footprints. And yes.
Feel free to pause this if you're going to come to it, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the way in which this survey is. And what I'm trying to get at is, might there be differences in measurements of these things across men and women based on where you're surveying, when you're surveying?
So these are surveys that is the same. So it's two different surveys. I'm going to come to this later, but it's the same survey for men and women, basically. So maybe feel free to ask another question if I will answer in a few slides. And based on this first quantification, we document an important gap of 26% in the average carbon footprints of men and women, whereby women have a 26% lower footprint. Then we try to systematically analyze the potential drivers of this gap and the potential mechanisms, very much in the spirit of the gender wage gap literature. So basically, we try to see how much we can kill this gap by adding controls for observable characteristics that could be correlated with both kind of gender and carbon emissions. And we find that with a reset of individual covariates, we still have a gap of 20%. Then we explore the contribution of the difference in the scale of consumption for food and transport for different reasons, such as difference in biological needs. And we find that we still have a significant residual gap of 8% after controlling for the scale of consumption. And interestingly, the bulk of this residual gap is explained by a disproportionate contribution of differences in red meat consumption and in cars. So we think that this paper speaks to three strands of the literature. So first, we contribute to the literature that documents heterogeneity in carbon footprints along different dimensions. So there are actually very few papers that look at this gender dimension, and we think that this is really the first paper that not only investigate the magnitude of this gap using rich individual level data, but that also tries to understand what underlies this gap. We also connect to the literature on the political economy of climate policy support. There is a growing number of papers that documents gender gaps in terms of climate concerns, climate leadership, climate attitudes, and here we document a relatively new gap in terms of contribution to carbon emissions that we think could be related to these other climate-related climate gaps that are meaningful when you think about political economy of climate policy. And finally, we connect to a literature on gender differences in food and transport behaviors by shedding light on the climate or environmental impacts of such differences. So this is the outline of the talk. So let me just tell you a bit more about the data that we use. So we rely on two independent surveys that are representative of the French population. So first, we have a food survey conducted in 2017 that surveys more than 2,000 adults. It takes the form of a food diary. So individuals have to report their entire food consumption across 3 different days taken at random in three weeks. And the data producer aggregates the data to reflect daily food consumption. And we complement this with transportation survey, that is the latest wave of the National Transport Survey, where 13,000 adults are asked about all the trips that they made, first in terms of the short distance trip on a representative day, and second, all the trips that they made in the last 6 weeks that cover any long distance trip for business or holiday.
So I suppose that's where it comes in, is who, it's a question of representativeness there to some extent, but whether you're capturing non-working women or women who are surveyed at a particular time of day or who are likely to have particular travel patterns and so on, and whether that could.
So the survey is representative of the population. So it's conducted by the statistical agency. And it's a survey at individual level where households are first sampled, and then you pick one individual randomly in a household. So I don't think there is a bias related to employment, and we check that it is indeed representative of the French population.
Building on that, how do you think about what is individual in households? So imagine you had a household where one member was going to work and one was not going to work in order to look after family. How would you think about the trip, the travel that was done by the partner who went to work? Is that considered a shared?
No, so we allocate it's individual consumption here, means that you were the one making the trip, or you were the one consuming the food.
And it would be interesting to know how much, I have no scale of how much of carbon emissions could plausibly considered shared consumption.
So this
versus how much is purely individual. And then it would be really interesting to know how much your results change if you kind of reallocated these.
So then I think you'll be interested in, we show results by household arrangement, where we contrast findings for single individuals compared to couples, and this maybe will also shed light on some of these questions. But for now, we allocate to each individual their own consumption of transport and food. So to build this individual level carbon footprints, we are simply going to multiply the volumes of food or transport, so measured in kilogram of food or kilometer traveled, that are reported in these surveys, by very detailed emission intensity measures that we have for food at the product level for around 2,500 different products. So I can show you here really the richness of this emission intensity data that shows you for every bar a different food product. And you can see the colors correspond to different food categories. So on the right-hand side, you have more meat-based products that are much more carbon intensive. On the left-hand side, you have more kind of fruit and veg that are much less carbon intensive. At the same time, you see that it's very important to have this detailed food level products, because even within a kind of a broad food category, we have a lot of heterogeneity in contribution to in carbon emissions. We do the same for transportation. We're here, sorry. Yeah.
So on the food survey, this is measured for France, the sort of emissions per kilogram in France.
Yes, this is based on a classification that was made specifically for France.
Okay, and does that vary regionally at all, or how much? Yeah.
So this is an average for the country.
Oh.
Yeah. And importantly, this emission measure, they reflect life cycle emissions. So that's why we talk about footprints and not just emissions. So they really take into account any upstream emissions from deforestation or other contributions.
Sorry, this is going to account presumably for different caloric requirements for men and women. The recommended.
Yes, we're going to talk about this. So for now, everything that I show is not going to take this into account when we measure the raw gap, but then we're going to see how much differences in calorie intake contribute to the gap. This is what we call the scale adjusted gap. Yeah. And for transport, we're going to use also mode-specific emission intensity mostly, so emissions for buses, for public transport, etc. But the great thing about our data is that whenever people travel by car, and car represent like 85% of households emissions, we know exactly the emission intensity of the vehicle that is used, thanks to a match with the admin data on car registration. So similarly, if you focus on car trips, we also have a really wide heterogeneity in the carbon intensity of the vehicles used in a survey. And we're going to see how this heterogeneity also contributes to the gap that we document. So once we have built this carbon footprints measure, we're going to simply take the average difference between men and women, and this gives us the unadjusted gap. And then we're going to see how much the gap persists once we start controlling for observable characteristics in a simple OLS regression, where we're going to focus on this beta 1 coefficient on the dummy for being female. In terms of the characteristic that we have, we harmonize them across the different data set. And in the strictest regression, we have age, educational attainment, size of the city, household size, income, and occupational category, as well as employment status. And this will give us what we call the characteristics adjusted gap. And we later on look at these differences in the scale of consumption, where we additionally control for total calorie intake or kilometer traveled. Yeah.
Just on that scale adjusted, is controlling for kilometers one way you're trying to control for differences in job requirements?
Yes, so I'm going to explain later, but this scale adjustment has a different function for food and transport. For transport, it's taking into account the fact that men could have more constrained trips due to commuting, for example, but it's also a way to just see how much comes from this scale effect versus a carbon intensity effect. Yes.
For the food one, I'm curious, I have no idea what the nutrition science is, but do men need different macro and micronutrients from women? And is that something you can like think about as well when thinking about scale?
So there are not really different recommendations in terms of like protein intake versus like other types of micronutrients. It's mostly about the calorie intake. So our first results on the unadjusted gap is that we observe this 26% lower carbon footprints for women compared to men. And this is true both for food and transport. The magnitudes are exactly the same, funnily enough, because it really didn't have to be the case. So these figures reflect average annual footprints. So then we ask about the drivers of this gap, and we have in mind 4 broad sets of explanations. So one first reason why we might see this gap is because of other confounding factors in terms of observable characteristics of men and women, such as different employment status that could influence a demand for transport as well as for food. Second, there could be differences in the scale of consumption, and I pull here quite different drivers in this same category. For food, we have in mind that, of course, men need to eat more calories, and this is clearly driving some of our results. But also in terms of transport, because of gender differences on the labor market, we know that there could be differences in distances traveled. This has been studied in particular in labor economics in terms of the commuting distances, where women are typically happy to trade off part of their wage in order to have shorter commutes. So we're going to take this into account by controlling for the scale of their transport. Third, there could be, of course, within household allocation of tasks and specialization that could also explain our results, given that we allocate to each individual exactly what they consume. So for food, you can think about shared meals that are going to maybe trigger some convergence, while for transport, there could be more like specialization into paid versus domestic work that is going to influence demand for transport.
In the transport survey, like when you have any travel, you know who else is traveling with the person?
Yes, so we know the person is reporting their trips even if they're not driving the car, and we also know who else, we know how many passengers are traveling with them.
And that you're controlling for in the socioeconomic characteristics, or?
No, but we take this into account in our calculation of footprints, in the sense that for car trips, we divide the carbon footprints of the car trip by the number of passengers. So if you're traveling with more people, you have fewer emissions. Yeah.
Is there anything that takes into account the kind of gendered experience of climate impacts? So for example, women tend to experience climate disasters more kind of extremely. So if that could be sort of driving impacts and decisions around behaviors.
So there is evidence of this indeed. To my knowledge, this is mostly based on studies in lower income countries. Here we're really in a setting where to our knowledge, there is nothing documenting that men and women experience climate change differently in France. But so this connects to like maybe the last set of explanation that could underline this gap would be gender differences in preferences, broadly speaking, and these preferences could be either environmental or climate preferences. So I just consume less carbon intensive goods because I care about climate change, but they could also very well be non-environmental preferences, just other types of preference that happen to be correlated with carbon intensity of consumption. Yeah.
I'm sorry if I missed this earlier, but how are we thinking about potentially having kids with me on the trip? In coupled partners with kids, there's likely to be systematic differences in who drives the kids around more frequently, and that
exactly.
When my kids are with me, I eat different things than when they're not.
Interesting. We didn't have this in mind for food, but for transport, definitely. So kids are going to play a role in the sense that if I'm driving the kids to school, I divide the emissions from the cartridge by the number of people in the car, so including the kids. We have a robustness check, or like we check that all our results on the gap is not driven by this number of passengers in the car, because we also find a gap when we allocate the entire emissions from the cartridge to the respondent.
Yeah, I'm less interested in the like per capita adjustment and more that I'm just more likely to go to, McDonald's if the kids are with me. Okay.
So this is an interesting, it's something that we maybe want to explore more in a second paper, this kind of within household kind of influence, but here we don't really speak to this. So first, we start by addressing the first point by adding a set of controls. So here I'm showing you on this graph how the beta coefficient on female changes when we add stricter, more and more controls. So starting from the red point estimate, where we have just the controls for the survey wave. And on the y-axis, you can see the absolute gender gap. So there are absolute difference between men and women's carbon footprints. And you see that for food, adding all the socioeconomic characteristics doesn't really affect the gap. But for transport, as maybe you would expect, you see that once you start controlling for employment status, social professional category, and household income, we have a small reduction of this gap for transport, but still the gap persists, is at 20%. And in case you're wondering, we also do the exact same exercise, restricting the sample to only employed individual, having into account that employment status is really a big difference between men and women also in France, and we find actually a larger magnitudes for the gap. Yeah.
So all of these are from the demand side, right? But you started by saying that it's from the supply side, like there's more advertisement for certain products that are for men. So that's not something that you can, you're motivated by thinking about cars are being sold to men, certain kinds of cars, or burgers are more likely to be, right? Meat is more likely to be. So that's also the supply side story.
Yeah, so I think the point was more to say that there are some stereotypes in consumption that I think the advertisement industry is responding to and further fueling, if that makes sense. But it was not really to say this is supply side and we look at demand. So then, of course, there's a question of scale, which is most obvious for food. So it could just be that men have a higher food footprint because they eat more. So what we do here is to first observe that although in terms of dietary requirements, they would need 25% more calories. In the survey, we observe that they eat 37% more calories, which is partly due to greater alcohol consumption. And what this means by saying this is that controlling for actual calorie intake is going to kind of over control for this biological dimension of the problem. But still, when we do this, which is what we do here, so we compare this this characteristics adjusted gap, which is the one where we have all the socioeconomic controls, with what the gap becomes once we control for actual calorie intake. And the gap decreases a lot. So differences in calorie really contribute quite a lot to the gap, but we still have a significant gap of 8%. And when we do, and for transport, why do we want to control for the scale of consumption for transport is for slightly different reasons. It has to do with men's, the higher number of constrained trips for men, of course, depending on their status and on their situation, but partly due to their longer commutes. So here it's more that we want to test whether the result for transport is only driven by the fact that they travel longer distances versus conditional on traveling a certain distance, they have also a higher carbon intensity of their car trips. And this is what we see, to the extent that we still have a significant 9% gap for transport once we control for distances traveled. Yes.
Have you tried control? I guess I'm wondering, this is kind of control, almost the caloric one is almost controlling for a choice in and of itself, in the sense that if men are just choosing different food groups, those happen to be more calorie, have more calories, but it's really about, eating a burger is manly. And so, have you tried just controlling for different food categories of some kind and seeing sort of how much is just due to choice of food category versus intense? I'm just sort of thinking of other ways to think about quantity versus food type. Yeah.
That would be a different regression we could do. We do one focusing on meat right after. So maybe this will answer your question. Sorry, there was another question.
I think related to this, though, on transport, are you able to observe what's the purpose of each of the trips you observe?
Yes, we haven't really exploited it so far because because we aggregate everything at annual level on average, so we haven't really played around with purposes. What we have done is to control for commuting distance, excluding. We have also excluded business-related trips because there's partly maybe something more related to production than consumption, but we haven't done more than this. So now we ask, or we wonder, okay, what from which kind of products or goods come this residual gap that we find, and we have in mind that of all the goods that we have in our survey, red meat is really the one that is the most carbon intensive by far. And in terms of transport, we have both car, in particular for short distance trip, but we also have plane for long distance trips. And of these two, red meat and car are more clearly associated with gender stereotypes. So we run the same regression as before, but only taking the share of emissions that comes from red meat for food and emissions from cars for transport and emissions from flying. And what we find is that we have quite a large and significant gap in terms of emissions from red meats. Also one that is a bit smaller, but still significant for car emissions, but we cannot reject that we have no gender differences in emissions from flying. So this is quite interesting and maybe suggestive evidence that, this gap that we observe is driven also by gender preferences that are not really connected to climate concerns, but come from more stereotypes in consumption. Another way to see this disproportionate contribution of red meat and car is to ask how much does red meat explain the residual gap compared to red meat contribution to the average carbon footprints. So for the average household, for the average individual, red meat represents 14% of the footprints for food, but it represents 86% of the gender gap in carbon footprints once we control for socioeconomic characteristics and calories. For car, we have a slightly different picture, but the direction is the same. So car contribute disproportionately to average individual footprints. It's 82% of transport carbon footprint, but it represents 100% of the gender gap in carbon footprint once we account for socioeconomic characteristics and the scale of consumption. And what drives this gender gap in car emissions is not really the fact that women are less likely to travel by car. It's really that when they travel by car, they tend to have less carbon intensive car trips, both because they travel with more people in a car. And this is true even for singles who don't have kids. And because they use cars that are just less carbon intensive, so vehicles that are lower emissions. So finally, we investigate the potential role of household composition in influencing our gap. So we're going to do the same regression separately by household arrangement. So we have on single individuals, couples with children and couples without children. So a caveat here is that there is never a survey of two different individuals in the same household. So what we see is that for food, for which we have quite a low sample size for food, so when we split the sample, we have quite large confidence interval. We don't find really statistically significant differences across household arrangement, but we do find that singles without kids have slightly lower footprints, and that once women are observed in a couple, they tend to have a higher carbon emission than when they're singles, while men have a stable carbon footprint. So this could speak to some convergence in food habits. For transport, it's very different. We have a clear specialization pattern where we have a particularly large gap for couples with kids, which is black point estimate here, while we cannot really reject a null gap for singles. So this really suggests that household composition also plays a role in this gap in carbon footprints. So the last part of the paper and of this talk is really about understanding what these differences mean and what do we make with them. So to put our results in perspective, we first want to understand how much the picture would be radically different or not if we were considering the other sectors making up the average household carbon footprint. So we know that the rest of the carbon footprint in France is made of housing, the reallocation of emissions from final government consumption, and then other goods and services. And evidence from the literature suggests very little gap in terms of housing emissions between men and women. So we deduce that the gap in other goods and services other than housing, food, and transport would have to be 71% higher. Like women would need to have 71% higher emissions than men overall for all these other goods and services in order to cancel out the gap. So we think this is rather unlikely. And just last point, to understand the magnitude of our results, we compare the unadjusted gender gap that we find with the more documented income gap in carbon footprints, and we find that below median income households have 27% lower carbon footprints than above median income households, which is about the same as the gap that we. So in the interest of time, I'm going to just conclude here, but we have a working paper online with even more results. So we document a significant gender gap in carbon footprints based on data from France. It's not only due to differences in observable characteristics of the scale of consumption. It seems to be influenced by gender differences in preference that predate climate concerns. And we think an important implication is that gender would deserve more consideration in distributional analysis of climate policy, and also more work is needed to understand the determinants of this gap and how it could maybe influence other well-documented gender gap in climate outcomes. Thanks a lot.
Well, that's all for our paper presentations for today, but I feel like Robin's about to say something about the public event.
Yeah, so this evening we have a